Most people looked at Ark Raiders and saw another extraction shooter, but what they actually missed is that underneath the gunfights and the loot runs, there is a genuinely strange and quietly unsettling story about a world that was not destroyed so much as it was repurposed without anyone's permission, without a single word of explanation. I put this video together because I kept running into Ark Raiders lore that felt like it was sitting just below the surface of what the game actually shows you. The more I dug into it, the more it became clear that the story Embark is telling is not really about a war between humans and machines. It is about what happens to the idea of humanity when the thing threatening it does not even register you as a threat. One specific choice I made when assembling this was to lead with the Ark themselves rather than the human survivors, because I think once you have a clearer sense of what the Ark might actually be doing and why, everything the people in this world say and do lands completely differently. I also made the decision to present certain pieces of lore out of their in-game order, because when you rearrange them thematically rather than chronologically, a different picture starts to emerge, one that I find a lot more interesting than the straightforward invasion story most people assume this game is telling. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. Chapter 1. The Silence Before the Fall. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles into a place after something enormous has already happened. Not the quiet of peace, not the quiet of safety, but the quiet of aftermath, where the violence is done and what remains is just the evidence of it, sitting in the open air, slowly being reclaimed by whatever comes next. That is the quiet that defines the world of Ark Raiders. And understanding why that quiet exists and what replaced the noise that came before it is the first thing you need to do if you want to understand what this game is actually about. The world before the Ark arrived was, by all available accounts within the game's lore, recognizable as our own. Not a distant future version of Earth. Not some alternate timeline where technology had leaped forward in spectacular ways. The settlements, the infrastructure, the way people had organized themselves into communities and institutions, all of it points toward a version of Earth that was close enough to familiar that the loss of it carries weight. That is a deliberate choice on Embark's part, and it is one that pays off the longer you spend time in the ruins. What the lore suggests about the pre-Ark world is not spelled out in great detail, and that is actually part of what makes it compelling. You are not given long exposition dumps about the political climate or the state of global technology before the fall. Instead, you find fragments, notes left on desks, photographs half buried in debris, the remains of ordinary routines, a coffee mug sitting next to a keyboard, a child's drawing pinned to a wall that has since partially collapsed. These small artifacts do more work than any formal history lesson ever could, because they make the loss feel personal rather than abstract. One of the things the lore points toward, through these scattered fragments, is that the world before the Ark was not particularly prepared for what was coming, and not in the way you might expect from a science fiction premise like this. It is not that governments failed to act quickly enough, or that early warning systems were too slow. The suggestion is something stranger and more uncomfortable than that. The suggestion is that there was no warning worth responding to, that the arrival of the Ark did not announce itself in any way that human beings were equipped to interpret as a threat until it was already far, far too late. This is the detail that most people gloss over when they first encounter Ark Raiders, and it is worth sitting with for a moment. The Ark did not descend with warships and weapons fire. There was no declaration, no ultimatum, no attempt at communication that was then ignored or misunderstood. The Ark simply arrived. And then they began doing what they do. And by the time it became clear what that actually meant for the people already living on this planet, the shape of the world had already been fundamentally altered in ways that could not be undone. The earliest fragments of in-game lore that touch on the period of arrival are sparse, but they share a tone that is worth noting. There is a sense of confusion that predates the sense of danger. People were not immediately afraid, they were baffled. The initial reports, as one can piece them together, from scattered journal entries and audio logs, describe something that seemed almost wondrous before it seemed catastrophic. Lights in the sky, structures descending, movements that did not match anything in any existing database of known phenomena. That transition from wonder to terror is one of the most quietly devastating things the lore implies about the fall, because it means that for at least some period of time, people were watching what was happening with curiosity rather than alarm. They were trying to understand it, trying to make sense of it within frameworks that simply did not apply. And while they were doing that, the Ark were already doing what they came to do, indifferent whether they were being observed, studied, or feared. The geography of the game world reflects this history in ways that reward careful attention. The environments you move through as a raider are not simply ruined, they are layered. There is the original architecture of a world that was built by human hands for human purposes, roads and buildings, and infrastructure designed around the logic of human life. And then there is everything that was added or altered by the Ark, growing over and through the human-made structures, like something organic, despite being entirely mechanical. One possible reading of the game's environmental storytelling is that the Ark do not perceive the human-built world as something to be destroyed. They perceive it the way you might perceive an ant colony when you need to dig a hole in the ground, where it happens to be, not with malice, not with contempt, simply as something that is in the way of, or adjacent to, the thing you are actually interested in. That reading, if you accept it, changes everything about how you understand the Ark's behaviour throughout the rest of the game's lore. The settlements that survived the initial period of Ark activity are not, by and large, the places you might expect to have survived. The lore hints that survival in the early days had less to do with military capability or political organisation, and more to do with geography and luck. Places that the Ark, for whatever reason, did not need to pass through or alter. Places that fell beneath some threshold of relevance in whatever calculus the Ark were running when they decided where to focus their attention. This randomness of early survival is something that the human characters in the game's world are still grappling with, long after the initial crisis. Why here and not there? Why this community and not that one? The answers that have been developed over time, the theories and the rationalizations, vary wildly depending on which faction you're looking at and what their relationship to hope and despair currently is. But the underlying question is the same everywhere. Why were we the ones who made it? And what does that actually mean? The underground network of tunnels and bunkers that forms the backbone of the game's human civilization is itself a piece of lore worth examining. The decision to go underground was not, based on what the game suggests, purely tactical. It was not simply that the surface was dangerous and the underground was safe. It was that going underground meant becoming less visible, less relevant, less present in whatever the Ark were calculating when they looked at the surface of the planet and decided what to interact with. There is something deeply human about that response, and also something deeply strange when you think about it too long. The dominant survival strategy of an entire civilization reduced to hide well enough that the thing that arrived does not bother to look for you, not fight, not negotiate, not flee to somewhere else entirely, just make yourself small enough to be overlooked. That is the foundation on which the entire social structure of the Ark Raiders world is built, and it flavours everything else that follows. The bunker called Speranza is the most significant of these underground settlements, at least in terms of what the player directly interacts with. The name itself is worth noting. Speranza means hope, in Italian, in Portuguese. The word carries that meaning in languages spoken by millions of people across a world that has been largely unmade. Someone named this place Hope. Someone decided that was the right word for a hole in the ground where people hide from machines that descended from space. That person's thinking, and the thinking of everyone who accepted that name and made it their home, is at the core of what Ark Raiders is actually exploring. Speranza is not a beautiful place. The lore does not romanticize it. It is functional, cramped, organized around survival rather than comfort. And the people who live in it carry the weight of knowing exactly how precarious their situation is. But it persists. It keeps operating. People within it wake up in the morning, perform their roles, argue about resources and policy, fall in love, grieve, plan, and go through the motions of being alive in a way that insists on meaning, even when meaning is hard to locate. That insistence is what the game, at its best, seems to be most interested in. The social structure of Speranza and the other surviving communities is not uniform across the game's world, and the variations between them tell you a great deal about how different groups of people processed the same catastrophe and arrived at different conclusions about what to do next. Some communities became highly militarized. Some became focused on preservation and documentation. Some developed belief systems around the Ark that range from fear-based to something closer to reverence. All of these responses are present in the lore, and none of them are straightforwardly endorsed or condemned by the game's narrative. What is consistent across all of the surviving human communities, at least based on what the lore makes available, is a relationship with the surface world that is defined by both necessity and dread. They need the surface. The resources they require for continued survival cannot be fully supplied by underground systems alone. But the surface is where the Ark are. The surface is where the danger lives. And so the surface becomes the place that certain people have to go, whether they choose to or not, whether they are equipped for it or not, whether they come back from it or not. Those people are the Raiders. And before we get to who the Raiders are and what drives them, it is worth spending a little more time on the world they move through when they go up. Because the surface in Ark Raiders is not simply a combat zone, it is a record. Everything that happened in the early days of the Ark's arrival left marks that are still visible if you know how to read them. And reading those marks is one of the most interesting things you can do in this game. Narratively speaking, the architecture of destruction in the surface world is not chaotic, and that is the first thing that stands out when you start paying attention to it. When human-made things are destroyed by human conflict, the pattern of destruction reflects the logic of fighting. Blast radii, structural collapses caused by impact, fires spreading from point of origin outward. The evidence of intention, even if that intention was simply to hurt or stop the other side. The damage in the Ark Raiders' surface world does not read like that. The damage reads like something functional was being done, and the human infrastructure got in the way of that function. Roads and buildings were not destroyed in the way you destroy a thing you want to eliminate. They were altered, or pushed aside, or simply left alone in ways that seem random but might not be. The Ark, based on the evidence the surface world presents, were not fighting a war on the surface of this planet. They were working, and work, when it is done without regard for what it disrupts, looks like violence from the outside, even when it is not intended as such. This distinction between violence and indifference is one that comes up again and again in the lore of Ark Raiders, and it is one of the most philosophically interesting threads in the entire game. Because it matters enormously, in a human sense, whether the thing that unmade your world did so because it wanted to hurt you, or because it simply did not factor you into its calculations at all. Both outcomes look the same from the outside. The ruins are the same ruins either way, but the meaning you assign to those ruins and the stance you take toward whatever created them is completely different depending on which answer you believe. The flora and fauna of the surface have continued to exist through all of this, and the lore pays attention to that in subtle ways. The game's environments include vegetation, animal life, the ongoing processes of a natural world that did not particularly care about the arrival of the Ark any more than the Ark appeared to care about it. In some ways, the natural world of the surface has thrived in the absence of dense human activity. Certain areas are genuinely beautiful in a way that creates a jarring contrast with the mechanical structures of the Ark that have been inserted into them. That contrast is not accidental. The design of the surface world in Ark Raiders suggests a very specific kind of visual and narrative argument, that beauty and horror can coexist in the same space, that a place can be both astonishing and terrifying, that the world can go on being the world, with all of its colour and complexity, while something incomprehensible is being done to it by forces that do not recognise its beauty as relevant. If you have ever stood in a genuinely stunning environment in this game and thought about how wrong it felt that something terrible was also happening there, that feeling is the game working as intended. The seasons and weather patterns of the surface world are another element that the lore hints at having been altered in certain regions, though never dramatically or in ways that are fully explained. There are places where the temperature is not what it should be for the geography, places where the precipitation patterns seem off. These anomalies are mentioned in passing in various documents and journal entries, usually as practical concerns for raiders planning their runs, but they carry an implication that the Ark's activities have affected the environment in ways that go beyond the purely physical destruction of infrastructure. Whether this environmental alteration is intentional on the Ark's part, or simply a byproduct of their activities, is something the lore leaves deliberately ambiguous. One possible reading is that the Ark are not particularly concerned with the long-term habitability of the planet's surface, which would be consistent with the idea that they are here for a specific resource or purpose and do not intend to remain indefinitely. Another reading is that the alterations are calculated, part of some larger process whose full scope humans have not yet been able to observe or understand. The sky above the surface world is perhaps the most visually iconic element of Ark Raiders' aesthetic, and it is also one of the richest pieces of environmental lore the game provides. The Ark structures that hang in the upper atmosphere, visible from the ground as enormous shapes that block and filter the light, are a constant reminder of scale. They are not hidden, they are not subtle, they are simply enormous, and they have been there long enough that the human survivors have developed entire frameworks of thought around their presence. Some of those frameworks are practical. Raiders pay attention to the movement and activity of the atmospheric structures, the way sailors once paid attention to weather patterns. Certain behaviours of the overhead Ark presence correspond to increased activity on the ground below. Others seem to signal periods of relative dormancy that experienced raiders know to take advantage of. This kind of practical relationship with Ark behaviour, treating it as something to be read and worked with rather than understood, is characteristic of the raider culture that the game builds its moment-to-moment gameplay around. The early human attempts to communicate with the Ark, as described in various lore documents, are among the most quietly sad pieces of the entire narrative. Multiple attempts were made using multiple approaches at multiple points during the initial period of the Ark's arrival. Radio signals, mathematical sequences, physical approaches by individuals or small groups attempting to make contact. The lore does not describe these attempts with contempt or present the people who made them as foolish. It presents them with a kind of respect for the impulse, while making clear that none of them produced any response whatsoever. The Ark did not respond because the Ark, as far as the lore suggests, does not communicate. Not in any way that maps to what human beings mean by the word. This is not a language barrier in any meaningful sense. It is not that the Ark speaks a different language. It is that communication, in the sense of sending and receiving intentional messages between parties who acknowledge each other's existence, may simply not be something the Ark does with anything. What that implies about what the Ark actually is will be something we get into more fully in the next chapter. For now, the important thing to hold on to from this early period of the world's history is the particular shape of the loss. It was not a war lost, it was not a negotiation that failed. It was something more like arriving at a party you were not invited to and realizing that the party is not for you, was never for you, and that the people hosting it are not even aware that you think of it as a party. The world that existed before, with all of its complications and conflicts and moments of genuine beauty, did not end because someone decided to end it. It ended because something arrived that had different plans for the same space, and those plans did not include the people already there. That is not a comfortable narrative. It does not offer an enemy to focus on or a wrong that can be clearly articulated, and that discomfort, that absence of a clean enemy to direct the anger of an entire civilization toward, is what shapes the human culture of the Ark Raiders world more than anything else that happened in the early days. When you cannot fight the thing that ended your world because it will not fight back, you have to figure out something else to do with the energy of surviving. That figuring out is what the rest of this video is about, the lore fragments that deal with the period immediately following the initial Ark activity, the months and years when people were still trying to orient themselves to what had happened, paint a picture of extraordinary psychological strain existing alongside extraordinary practical ingenuity. Humans are, among other things, remarkably good at solving problems under pressure. The problem of how to survive in a world that has been fundamentally altered by the arrival of something incomprehensible was one that people worked on with the same focus and creativity they had always applied to difficult problems. The solutions they found were imperfect. They are still imperfect. The world of Ark Raiders is not a post-apocalyptic setting in which humanity has recovered and rebuilt in any clean or complete sense. It is a world in which people are still in the middle of working out how to exist in a situation they did not choose and cannot fully understand. The lore treats this ongoing nature of the crisis as a feature rather than a background assumption, and it is one of the reasons the world feels alive in a way that many post-apocalyptic settings do not. The children who were born after the Ark's arrival, who have never known any other world, appear in the lore in ways that add a particular texture to the game's emotional landscape. For them, the underground tunnels and the dangerous surface and the presence of the Ark overhead are simply the conditions of existence. They did not lose the world their parents or grandparents describe. They inherited a different world, and they're growing up inside it with a set of assumptions and adaptations that the older survivors sometimes find unsettling and sometimes find genuinely hopeful. This generational divide within the surviving communities is not a major focus of the game's available lore, but it is present, and it points towards something important about the long game of human survival in this world. Cultures adapt. What is traumatic to one generation becomes normalized to the next. The Ark Raiders world is old enough now that there are people in it for whom the pre-Ark era is history rather than memory. And those people relate to the situation differently. They are not in mourning for something they lost. They are simply trying to live in the world they have. The documentation of the pre-Ark world has become a significant cultural activity in the surviving communities, according to lore fragments scattered throughout the game. People collect and preserve artifacts from before the fall. They record oral histories. They try to reconstruct what was lost, not necessarily because they expect to restore it, but because they feel the weight of it being forgotten. There is an archivist impulse in the Ark Raiders world that is genuinely moving when you encounter it, because it represents one of the most fundamentally human responses to catastrophic loss. The insistence that what was lost mattered, and that the record of it should be kept. The archives that exist in Speranza and in other underground communities are not just historical repositories, they are also practical resources. Knowledge of pre-Ark infrastructure, geography, and technology has direct survival value. A map of underground utilities from a city that was partially dismantled by Ark activity might tell a raider team exactly where to go and what to avoid. A technical manual for a type of equipment that was common before the fall might enable the repair of something critical to community survival. History and pragmatism are wound together in the Ark Raiders world in a way that gives both more weight. The religious and quasi-religious belief systems that have developed in the years since the Ark's arrival are hinted at in the lore in ways that are never fully mapped out but are consistently present in the background. The Ark have inspired a range of spiritual responses, from those who interpret their arrival in apocalyptic terms drawn from existing traditions, to those who have developed entirely new frameworks of meaning around the experience of living under machine-dominated skies. The game does not endorse any of these frameworks, but it treats them with the seriousness they deserve as genuine human responses to an unprecedented situation. Some of the belief systems that have emerged focus on the idea that the Ark's arrival was in some cosmic sense inevitable or even necessary. That the world before the fall was heading somewhere unsustainable, and that what happened was a correction of a kind. These perspectives are not universally held, and they generate real friction in communities where people who lost everything to the Ark's arrival are expected to coexist with people who have made a kind of peace with, or even meaning from, that loss. The political and interpersonal dynamics this creates are something the game's lore gestures at without fully resolving. What all of this amounts to, as a foundation for the story Ark Raiders is telling, is a world that is in the process of deciding what it is. It is past the acute phase of catastrophe. The immediate survival crisis is not over, but the communities that still exist have found ways to persist. What they have not found, and what the game's ongoing narrative seems to be circling around, is an answer to the larger question of what they are surviving for, what the endgame looks like, whether there is an endgame at all in any meaningful sense. These are questions that the various factions and individuals in the Ark Raiders world are answering in very different ways, and the tension between those different answers is what drives most of the human drama in the lore. Chapter 2. What the Ark actually is talking about. The Ark is one of the stranger exercises the lore of Ark Raiders invites you into, because the game is very careful, in a way that feels deliberate rather than evasive, to never fully answer the question. What you get instead of an answer is a collection of perspectives, each of which illuminates something true about the Ark, while leaving the full picture unresolved. And one possible reading of why the game is structured this way is that the full picture, by design, is not available, not because the writers have not worked it out, but because the situation the game depicts is one in which the full picture genuinely cannot be known by the people living inside it. The name itself is worth starting with, the Ark. It is a word that carries a lot of possible meanings. An arc is a curve, a trajectory, a path from one point to another. It is also a term used in certain contexts to describe a span of time or a narrative shape. Arc, as in story arc, as in the rising and falling of something that has a beginning and an end. The fact that the mechanical entities that descended from space are called the Ark by the human survivors suggests something about how those survivors have chosen to frame their relationship to what happened. Not a wall, not an end. An arc, something with motion, something that, by implication, might eventually pass. Whether that framing is wishful thinking or genuine insight is one of the questions the lore never definitively resolves. But the name is interesting precisely because of what it implies about the mental stance of the people who adopted it. Calling the threat an arc rather than, say, a siege or an occupation or an invasion is a choice that smuggles in a certain kind of hope. It says, this is not permanent, this is a shape in time. This has a trajectory that continues past the point we are currently at. The physical appearance of the arc entities themselves varies across different types and scales, and the law makes clear that what human survivors have been able to directly observe is almost certainly not the complete picture of what the ark consists of. What has been observed ranges from smaller autonomous units that move through the surface environment on what appear to be patrol or collection missions, to enormous structures of unclear purpose that dwarf anything human engineers ever built. The variety within the ark is itself a data point. This is not a simple system. Whatever the ark are, they appear to be organized around a complexity that rivals or exceeds anything comparable in human experience. The smaller ark units that raiders most frequently encounter are the ones that have been most thoroughly studied, at least in the limited sense that humans have been able to study them at all. Their behavior patterns have been catalogued to a degree that makes meaningful tactical use possible. They respond to certain stimuli in predictable ways. They operate within recognizable zones of activity. They can be avoided if you understand their rhythms, or engaged if you do not. But the reasons behind their behavior, the actual goals driving each individual action, remain genuinely opaque even after years of observation. One possible reading of the smaller ark units is that they are not individually intelligent in any meaningful sense, that they are more analogous to cells in a larger organism, or to tools operated by a will that exists at a level of organization far above the individual unit. This reading would explain the consistency of their behavior and the apparent absence of anything that looks like individual decision-making or adaptation at the unit level. It would also explain why direct attempts to communicate with individual ark units have produced nothing. You do not communicate with a wrench, you communicate with the hand that holds it. The larger ark structures, particularly the ones that are visible from the ground in the upper atmosphere, are described in law documents with a kind of awe that is clearly involuntary. Even the most hardened and pragmatic raiders seem to find it difficult to discuss the overhead structures without a shift in their language that registers something beyond simple analysis. They are simply too large. They operate on a scale that does not fit comfortably inside human cognitive frameworks, even when you know they are there and have learned to treat them as a feature of the environment. They remain, after all this time, genuinely astonishing in a way that nothing human-made quite manages. The function of the large overhead structures is among the most contested questions in Ark Raiders lore. Multiple theories exist within the game's world, and none of them have been confirmed or definitively ruled out by available evidence. One theory holds that they are processing facilities, collecting and refining something from the planet's surface or atmosphere. Another holds that they are communication or coordination hubs, managing the activity of the smaller units below. A third, less widely held but not easily dismissed, suggests that they are something more like habitats, that the overhead structures might be places where some higher form of Ark presence actually resides, rather than purely functional infrastructure. This third theory is the one that tends to make people the most uncomfortable, and for a reason that is worth articulating. If the large overhead structures are habitats, that implies a kind of presence, a kind of being there that is different from a machine fulfilling a function. Machines do not need habitats. They need power and maintenance. Habitats imply something that experiences the space it occupies, something that, in some sense, lives in it. And the implications of the Ark having that kind of relationship to the space they have inserted themselves into are significant, because they push back against the idea of the Ark as purely mechanical, purely functional, purely devoid of inner experience. The question of whether the Ark have anything that could be called consciousness is the deepest and most contested philosophical question in the entire Ark Raiders lore ecosystem, and it is handled with real care by the game. It is not answered, it is circled. People in the game's world hold very different positions on it, and the evidence available supports multiple positions without conclusively settling the question. This is, again, possibly the most honest thing the game could do with a question of that magnitude. Because the honest answer to whether an entirely alien system of intelligence is conscious in any sense that humans can meaningfully relate to is, we do not know. We may not be able to know. What the lore does strongly suggest, though, is that the Ark are not random. Whatever they are doing on and around this planet, it is organised. It follows patterns. The activity of the smaller units, the placement and function of the larger structures, the way different areas of the surface have been treated differently, all of it points towards something that is, at minimum, executing a coherent plan. Whether that plan was made by something conscious or by something that operates without consciousness but with extraordinary complexity is something the lore leaves open. But the plan itself, the fact that there is a plan, seems clear. The material composition of Ark structures and units has been a subject of intense practical interest for the human communities that interact with the surface world. Ark materials are unlike anything that existed in the pre-Ark world, and they have properties that have significant implications for both survival technology and weapons development. The fact that Ark materials are identifiable as distinct from anything in the pre-Ark catalogue of known substances is itself a piece of lore worth noting. They did not come from here. They were not assembled from Earth resources, at least not initially. They came with the Ark, from wherever the Ark came from. Whether the Ark's activities on Earth have involved the conversion of Earth materials into Ark materials, or whether the Ark are operating purely on what they brought with them, is something the lore does not fully specify. But there are hints that certain extraction and processing activities the Ark engage in on the surface may involve transforming local materials into something the Ark can use for their own purposes. If that is the case, it reframes the relationship between the Ark and the Earth in a significant way. They are not just using the planet as a location, they are using it as a resource. The use of Earth as a resource raises a question that the lore is very deliberately dancing around. What resource? What exactly is the Ark here for? What is it about this particular planet, in this particular location in space, that drew them here and keeps them here? This is the central mystery at the heart of Ark Raiders, and it is one that different characters and factions in the game have very different ideas about. Some believe the answer is purely material, that there is a mineral or element or compound on or in the Earth that the Ark require. Others believe the answer is more abstract, pointing to the planet's position or its electromagnetic properties or some other non-material characteristic. A smaller number of people in the Ark Raiders world have begun to develop a theory that is considerably more unsettling than any of the purely material explanations. This theory, which is present in the lore in fragmentary form and is never fully articulated by any single character, suggests that the Ark are not here for anything the Earth produces. They are here for something that the Earth is, that the planet itself, perhaps including the life that has evolved on it over billions of years, is somehow constitutive of what the Ark came for, that the resource is not something that can be extracted and taken away, but is something that requires the Ark to be present, interacting with the planet directly, over an extended period of time. This theory, if it has any validity, would explain several things that the purely extractive model does not neatly account for. It would explain why the Ark have not simply taken what they want and left. It would explain the presence of the large overhead structures as a long-term installation rather than a temporary processing hub. It would explain why the Ark have not made any effort to eliminate the human population, which would have been well within their apparent capability if they had wanted to, and it would explain the peculiar selectivity of Ark behaviour in different regions, which does not always map cleanly onto the distribution of mineral or other easily identifiable material resources. The ecological argument for what the Ark might be here for is one of the most intriguing threads in the lore, and it is one that connects back to the environmental observations that careful raiders have been accumulating for years. The gradual changes in the surface environment, the temperature anomalies, the shifts in atmospheric composition that certain instruments have been able to detect, the altered behavior of animal populations in regions of intense arc activity, all of these data points can be assembled into a picture of something happening at a planetary scale that goes beyond simple extraction. What that picture means, in practical terms for the human communities trying to survive within it, is difficult to determine. If the Ark are doing something to the planet itself, something that operates on a time scale and a scale of complexity that dwarfs human comprehension, then the question of what to do about it becomes even more intractable than it already was. You cannot fight a geological process. You cannot negotiate with a planetary transformation. You can only try to survive inside it, and perhaps try to understand it well enough to anticipate what comes next. The Ark's apparent relationship to time is another element of the lore that deserves attention, because it suggests something important about the nature of the entities themselves. The Ark do not appear to operate on human timescales in any meaningful sense. The activities they are engaged in seem to be oriented toward outcomes that are very far in the future by any human measure. Years, decades, possibly centuries. The infrastructure they have built is not the infrastructure of a short-term operation. It is built to last. It is built with the assumption of continued presence. This relationship to time is deeply disorienting for the human communities in the Ark Raiders world, because it forces a confrontation with scale that humans are not naturally equipped to handle. Human planning horizons are by biological and cultural necessity relatively short, decades at most, for the most far-sighted individuals and institutions. The Ark appear to be operating on timelines that are orders of magnitude longer, and that asymmetry, the sense that whatever the Ark are doing, it is part of a project whose conclusion will not occur within any human lifetime, or possibly within many human lifetimes, is one of the most psychologically difficult aspects of the situation to come to terms with. What the Ark communicate to each other, or whether communication is even the right word for whatever coordination occurs between different Ark elements, is entirely unknown. The lore makes no claims about Ark internal processes beyond what can be inferred from observation of external behavior, but the coordination that is observable, the way different Ark units and structures seem to be acting in concert towards shared goals without any visible or audible communication mechanism, suggests that something is happening between them that serves the same function as communication, even if it operates through entirely different means. Some researchers within the game's world have speculated that Ark coordination might be quantum in nature, or might involve mechanisms that are simply not detectable by human technology. Others have suggested that individual Ark units might not actually be coordinating at all in a real-time sense, but rather all executing the same preloaded program, like an incredibly complex clockwork system in which every part knows exactly what to do because it was designed to do it from the beginning. This latter theory has the advantage of not requiring the Ark to have any ongoing communication capability, but it raises its own questions about the nature and origin of the program being executed. The Ark's response to human violence is something that has been extensively documented because it has direct survival implications for raiders operating on the surface. The Ark do respond to being attacked. They defend themselves. They pursue threats with a persistence that makes disengagement difficult once contact has been established. But the nature of this response is interesting when you look at it carefully. The Ark do not appear to retaliate in a way that goes beyond the immediate situation. They do not conduct reprisal campaigns against human settlements based on raider activity. They do not escalate their activity in a region in response to sustained human opposition. This behavior, or rather this non-behavior, points towards something important about the Ark's relationship to the human population. They respond to immediate threats as threats, but they do not appear to categorize humans as an enemy in any broader strategic sense. Humans are not, in the Ark's apparent calculus, important enough to have a strategic response. Individual Ark units defend themselves from damage, but the Ark as a system does not appear to be at war with humanity, which, when you think about the implications of that, is both a relief and a deeply strange piece of information to sit with. The question of whether the Ark have ever been something other than what they currently are is raised by certain fragmentary pieces of lore that are among the most intriguing in the game. There are hints in some of the older and more obscure documents that can be found in the surface world of something that might be interpreted as evidence of Ark presence before the event that the human survivors think of as the beginning of the Ark's arrival. Not a previous invasion, something more ambiguous, evidence of Ark-adjacent technology or Ark-adjacent materials in contexts that predate the arrival by a significant margin. If this interpretation is correct, and it is one possible reading rather than a certain one, it suggests that the Ark's relationship to Earth is not as simple as a first contact scenario. It suggests a history between the Ark and this planet that is older than anyone currently alive has any way to know about. That the arrival, from the Ark's perspective, might not have been an arrival at all. It might have been a return. The implications of that, if you follow them, are significant enough to reshape the entire narrative framework of the game. Because if the Ark have been here before, then the question is not just what do they want now? The question is what do they want now that they have come back for? And the difference between those two questions is enormous. The materials science work that has been done on recovered Ark technology represents the most concrete human attempt to understand what the Ark are and how they function, and the results of that work are among the more fascinating pieces of lore available. Ark materials do not degrade in the ways that human-made materials do. They do not rust. They do not corrode in the presence of the biological agents that break down most organic and inorganic human-made materials. They maintain their properties under conditions that would destroy most comparable human technology. This durability has made recovered Ark material extraordinarily valuable to human communities, for obvious practical reasons. But it has also provided an unexpected data point about the Ark's origins. The resistance to degradation suggests that wherever the Ark came from, the environmental conditions were very different from those on Earth. Different enough that their materials are over-engineered by Earth standards, built to withstand conditions that do not exist here, which in turn suggests something about the kind of environment the Ark are native to, or at least something about the environments they have operated in before arriving here. The energy systems of the Ark are among the least understood aspects of their technology from a human perspective. The Ark units and structures clearly require and use energy. They do things. They move. They process. They maintain their structures over time. All of that requires power, but the source of that power is not immediately apparent in the way that human power systems are. There is no obvious fuel being consumed, no exhaust, no obvious input-output relationship that human engineers have been able to map onto existing frameworks of energy science. One hypothesis that has been developed within the game's scientific community, such as it is that the Ark have access to an energy source or an energy conversion process that is genuinely beyond current human physics, not just beyond current human technology, but beyond current human understanding of how physical systems can work. This is a significant claim, and the law treats it carefully, but the evidence that the available alternatives cannot explain what is observed is presented consistently enough to take it seriously as a possibility. The aesthetic of the Ark, the visual and physical language of their structures and units is not random. It is consistent in ways that suggest a genuine design sensibility, even if that sensibility is not one that maps to any human aesthetic tradition. There is a logic to arc forms, a grammar of shapes and materials that repeats across different scales and contexts. This consistency suggests something important about the nature of the intelligence or the system that produced it. Only coherent minds or coherent systems produce coherent aesthetics. Whatever the arc are, they are not chaos. The way light interacts with arc structures is one of the most visually distinctive elements of the game's world, and it is also, in a small way, one of the more interesting lore details. Arc surfaces do not simply reflect light the way most human-made materials do, they do something else with it. Something that is difficult to describe precisely, but that creates a visual effect that is consistently noted as uncanny by characters within the lore. There is a quality to the light around arc structures that people who spend a lot of time on the surface have learned to recognize as a navigational and situational awareness cue. Where the light looks like that, the arc are present, even when you cannot see them directly. The arc's apparent indifference to weather is another data point that the lore makes available. Arc units and structures operate identically across all surface weather conditions. Rain, snow, heat, cold, storm, none of it appears to affect arc function. This robustness to environmental variation is consistent with the material durability already noted, but it goes further. It is not just that arc materials hold up under adverse conditions, it is that arc operations do not adapt to weather in the way that any Earth-based system, biological or mechanical, must adapt. The arcs seem to exist in a kind of operational bubble that the natural environment presses against without penetrating. What this suggests about the origin environment of the arc is something the lore leaves open, but it pushes in a consistent direction. Wherever the arc developed or were developed, it was not a stable, hospitable environment like Earth. The adaptations that make them invulnerable to Earth weather suggest that the conditions they are built for are far more extreme, which means Earth, from a physical and environmental standpoint, is actually quite easy for them. This is an uncomfortable thought, though not a surprising one. What it confirms is the asymmetry that defines every human encounter with the arc. They are not struggling to be here. This place is not a challenge for them. They are here because they chose to be here, and they will leave, if they ever leave, for exactly the same reason. Chapter 3. The Factions That Survived. The history of how human communities organized themselves after the Ark's arrival is not a linear story. It is more like a branching delta of decisions and circumstances, each of which produced different social structures, different values, different relationships to the ongoing crisis, and different ideas about what surviving it should actually look like. The factions that exist in the Ark Raiders world today are not the inevitable outcome of a single process. They are the accumulated result of thousands of individual choices made under extraordinary pressure, and understanding them means understanding something of what it was like to have to make those choices when no good options were available. The earliest period of post-arrival human organization was characterized by pragmatism above all else. Ideology, political affiliation, cultural identity, all of these things took a back seat in the immediate aftermath, when the primary task was simply keeping enough people alive to maintain the possibility of a future. The communities that survived this period did so largely because they found ways to suppress internal conflict long enough to solve immediate material problems. Food, water, shelter, medical care, security, the basic infrastructure of survival demanded a kind of unity that the pre-Ark world, with all of its luxuries of disagreement, had not always been able to sustain. But pragmatism under pressure is not stable as a long-term social organizing principle. It works as long as the pressure is acute enough that no one can afford to prioritize anything beyond immediate survival. As the immediate crisis stabilized, even partially, even imperfectly, the things that pragmatism had suppressed began to reassert themselves. Questions about leadership and legitimacy, questions about resource distribution, questions about who deserved what and on what basis, questions about what the point of surviving actually was. These are the kinds of questions that produce factions, because they are the kinds of questions that different people with equally sincere commitments answer very differently. The factions that are present in the Ark Raiders world represent a spectrum of responses to these questions that is broad enough to include perspectives that are nearly incompatible with each other. On one end of the spectrum, you have communities organized around rigid hierarchy and militaristic discipline, which have found stability in the clarity of command structures and the suppression of certain kinds of internal dissent. On the other end, you have more decentralized arrangements that have prioritized individual autonomy and collective negotiation, which have found flexibility at the cost of certain kinds of efficiency. And between those poles, there is a wide range of hybrid arrangements that have borrowed from multiple models and evolved in response to the specific conditions of their particular location and history. The most militarized of the factions in the Ark Raiders world are interesting not just as a power structure, but as a symptom of a particular way of processing the Ark's presence. When the threat is something that cannot be negotiated with and cannot be fully understood, one possible response is to invest very heavily in the tools and structures that deal with threats, weapons, training, discipline, chain of command. The logic is straightforward. If we cannot solve the problem of the Ark, we can at least maximize our ability to survive contact with it. And the organizations that have followed this logic most consistently have, in many cases, produced exactly what they set out to produce. They survive. Their people are better equipped and better trained than in communities that have taken other approaches. The cost of that survival is something the law examines with some care, and the costs are real. Heavily militarized communities in the Ark Raiders world tend to have internal cultures that are difficult in ways that are not always visible from the outside. The suppression of dissent that makes military discipline functional also suppresses other things: creativity, emotional honesty, the kind of slow, messy negotiation about values and priorities that democratic cultures generally produce, but that military hierarchies tend to find inefficient. The people in these communities are often competent and often loyal, and sometimes genuinely heroic. They are also sometimes trapped in systems that do not allow them to be much else. The communities that have organized themselves around the accumulation and protection of knowledge represent another significant faction type in the Ark Raiders world, and they are perhaps the most internally varied of the major groupings. What they share is a conviction that understanding the Ark, or at least understanding the world the Ark have created, is among the highest possible priorities for surviving humanity. What they disagree about, sometimes intensely, is what understanding is for and what should be done with it once achieved. Some of the knowledge-focused communities are essentially archivists, primarily concerned with preserving what was known before the Ark's arrival, and using that knowledge to maintain existing technologies and practices. Others are more oriented toward original research, trying to develop new frameworks and new capabilities by studying the Ark directly, studying the altered environment, studying the ways that human beings and human communities have responded to the situation they are in. The tension between these two orientations, backward-looking preservation versus forward-looking adaptation, is a productive source of internal conflict in the knowledge-focused faction of the Ark Raiders world. The faction or faction-adjacent groupings that have developed belief systems oriented around the Ark are some of the most philosophically interesting communities in the lore, and also some of the most politically contentious. They range from communities that have incorporated the Ark into pre-existing religious frameworks as a kind of judgment or divine intervention, to groups that have developed entirely new cosmologies oriented specifically around the experience of living in the Ark world, to small and sometimes isolated communities that have moved towards something closer to reverence for the Ark themselves. That last category, the communities that have moved toward reverence rather than simply accommodation of the Ark, is treated by the law with the same even-handedness it applies to the other community types. These communities are not presented as simply deluded or as dangerous cults, though from the perspective of more pragmatic factions, they sometimes look like both. They have developed based on extended observation and in some cases direct interaction with Ark entities in ways that most communities try to avoid, a set of ideas about the Ark that are, if not provably correct, at least coherent. Their relationship to the Ark is different from what most survivors have, and the law suggests that this different relationship has, in some cases, produced different outcomes than the norm. The political relationships between factions are complex and not always organised around simple alliance and opposition. The Ark Raiders world does not have a single clear power structure or a dominant faction that everyone else defines themselves against. Instead, the faction landscape is more like a web of bilateral and multilateral relationships, some cooperative, some hostile, some primarily defined by grudging coexistence. The resources and knowledge that different factions control create dependencies that sometimes force cooperation between groups that are otherwise deeply incompatible in their values and methods. The trade networks that operate between surviving communities are among the most significant political structures in the Ark Raiders world, and they are organised around a logic that cuts across factional lines in interesting ways. The surface world contains resources that are valuable to all human communities regardless of their ideological orientation. Food crops grown in certain surface areas, water purification materials, medical supplies from pre-Ark infrastructure, Ark materials that can be repurposed for human use. The people who move between communities to facilitate this trade occupy a social role that is both valued and precarious because they are necessary to everyone's survival and therefore have a kind of leverage that pure power hierarchies find uncomfortable. Raiders are a significant part of these trade networks, and the relationship between the raider culture and the formal faction structures is one of the more interesting social dynamics in the game's lore. Raiders are not neatly inside any single faction. They come from various community backgrounds and operate according to a professional ethic that is, in some ways, distinct from the values of any particular community. They are, by the nature of their work, more comfortable with the surface than most people. They are more practically oriented toward the Ark as a daily reality rather than an abstract threat or an object of ideological contemplation. The professional culture of raiding is, within the Ark Raiders world, a recognised and structured thing. There are norms. There is a kind of ethics, some of it explicit and some of it unspoken, around how raiders operate in relation to each other and in relation to the communities they serve. There are traditions and practices that have developed over years of collective experience with the realities of surface operation. The fact that this culture has had time to develop and codify itself is itself a piece of law because it marks how far the Ark Raiders world has moved from the acute crisis of the initial years into something that is, in its own strange way, a going concern. The relationship between different factions and the raider community is not uniform. Some of the more militarized communities have formal structures for raider operations, treating raiding as a military function with clear chains of command and defined operational protocols. Others have a more informal relationship, essentially contracting with independent raider teams for specific jobs while maintaining a separate military capacity for defense. And some communities are primarily organized around the raider model itself, with raiding as the central economic and social activity rather than something that happens alongside a more conventional community structure. The way resources flow between factions and the political consequences of that flow creates a kind of background economic and political story in the Ark Raiders world that is not always on the surface of the law, but that shapes almost everything else. Who has what? Who needs what from whom? Who controls the routes between important locations? These material realities drive factional politics in ways that often override ideological commitments, and the law is relatively honest about that. Communities that sincerely despise each other's values will still trade when the alternative is resource scarcity they cannot afford. The governing structures within different factions vary as much as the factions themselves, and the law provides glimpses of several of them without fully mapping the political landscape of any single community. What emerges from these glimpses is a picture of human governance under extreme conditions, which tends to be messier and more personal than any idealized model of governance would suggest. Power in the Ark Raiders world is held by the people who can keep other people alive, the people who control critical resources, the people who have skills or knowledge that cannot be easily replaced, and sometimes simply the people who are in the right place with the right personality at the moment a particular community was being organized. That mixture of merit, luck, and force of personality is probably the most accurate picture of how human governance actually works under pressure. The children of factional leaders in the Ark Raiders world occupy a particular social position that the law touches on in interesting ways. In communities where power has stabilized enough for succession to be a real concern, the question of how authority is transferred has produced a range of solutions. Some communities have moved toward hereditary arrangements, effectively, where leadership passes within families or close networks. Others have developed merit-based systems of selection. Others have created councils or consensus structures that distribute power rather than concentrating it. Each of these solutions creates its own set of problems, and the political instability that results from unsuccessful succession has consumed more than one community in the years since the Ark's arrival. The internal politics of any given faction are not separable from its external relations, and the law makes this connection repeatedly. A community that is experiencing internal power struggles is more vulnerable to external pressure and more likely to make poor decisions about its relationship to other factions. Conversely, a community that faces acute external threat often experiences an internal consolidation of power that resolves, at least temporarily, disputes that would otherwise be ongoing. The Ark, paradoxically, have sometimes served as a stabilizing force for communities that were on the edge of internal collapse, because shared threat is one of the most effective suppressors of internal conflict. The factions that have tried to develop diplomatic relationships with each other, rather than simply managing bilateral trade or military deterrence, are doing something relatively new in the Ark Raiders world, and the law treats these diplomatic efforts with a kind of cautious interest. The conditions that make meaningful diplomacy possible, a degree of material stability, a recognized framework for negotiation, leaders on both sides who are willing and able to make and honor commitments do not always exist in this world. When they do, something interesting can happen. Not peace exactly, but something closer to a managed relationship, which in this world counts as a significant achievement. The role of women in the various faction structures of the Ark Raiders world is not specifically mapped in the law in any systematic way, but the glimpses provided suggest a picture that is varied across different communities and generally reflects how those communities have structured authority and specialization in other domains. In communities organized around martial culture, the integration of women into warrior and leadership roles varies. In knowledge-focused communities, competence tends to be the primary criterion for status. In smaller and more informal communities, the practical contributions of individuals tend to determine their standing, regardless of gender. None of this is idealized or presented as solved. It is presented as work in progress, which is probably the most honest way to represent it. The cultural production of the surviving factions is another piece of the lore that reveals something important about the communities themselves. People make things. Even in circumstances of extreme scarcity and ongoing danger, human beings produce art, music, stories, humour, ritual, and all the other forms of meaning-making that are as essential to genuine survival as food and water. The specific cultural productions of different communities in the Ark Raiders world reflect their values and their relationship to their situation in ways that are sometimes more revealing than their formal structures and stated beliefs. The music that has developed in the underground communities, the visual art that appears on the walls of bunkers and tunnels, the stories that circulate in oral tradition, these are not footnotes to the survival story. They are central to it. They are the means by which communities maintain a sense of shared identity and shared purpose. They are also, in some cases, repositories of practical knowledge encoded in forms that can survive the loss of more formal documentation. The survival of culture is the survival of something that, in the long run, might matter as much as the survival of biology. The factional conflicts that have erupted into open violence between human communities are among the darkest parts of the lore, and they are handled with neither celebration nor easy condemnation. The circumstances that produce human-on-human violence in the Ark Raiders world are the same circumstances that produce it everywhere. Scarcity, fear, failed communication, competing claims on resources and legitimacy, and the terrible logic of preemptive action when trust has broken down enough that waiting feels more dangerous than acting. None of this is pretty. None of it is heroic. It is simply human, in the least flattering sense of the word. What makes the human-on-human conflicts in the Ark Raiders world particularly grim is their context. The Ark are still there. The surface is still dangerous. Whatever threat the Ark represent has not diminished because two human communities have decided to fight each other over a water source or a storage depot. The resources spent on intra-human conflict are resources not spent on surviving the actual condition that is killing everyone. Raiders who operate between factions see this more clearly than most, because they exist at the intersection of multiple communities and see the costs of factional conflict from multiple vantage points simultaneously. The emergence of communities that have tried to position themselves as neutral or multifactional, serving multiple groups while pledging exclusive loyalty to none, is a relatively recent development in the Ark Raiders world, and one that the lore treats with complexity. These neutral or multifactional communities occupy a position of genuine utility, and in some cases genuine influence, because they can facilitate exchanges and communications that would not otherwise happen. But they also occupy a position of vulnerability, because a community that refuses to take sides in a conflict between factions is, in the logic of both factions, potentially a threat rather than a resource. The informational landscape of the Ark Raiders world is fragmented in ways that have profound implications for how factions understand their situation. There is no global information network. There is no reliable cross-community journalism or intelligence sharing. What different factions know about the broader situation of the Ark Raiders world is a patchwork of local observation, raider reports, trading partner intelligence, and rumour. The picture any single faction has of the whole is necessarily incomplete, and those incompleteness create both opportunities for manipulation and genuine tragedies of misunderstanding. Raiders, again, occupy a unique position in this informational landscape. Because they move between communities and across the surface of the world, they accumulate a broader and more varied picture of the situation than almost anyone else. The intelligence value of an experienced raider goes beyond their combat capability and their knowledge of the surface. It includes what they have seen, what they have heard, what they have been able to piece together from the fragments of the broader story that pass through them as they move. Some raider communities have formalized this intelligence function. Others treat it as a personal and informal matter. But the knowledge that circulates through raider networks is in many ways the closest thing the Ark Raiders world has to a global picture. The future of the factions, as the lore hints at it, is not clear or resolved. The tensions that currently exist within and between communities have not been resolved. The long-term question of what the surviving human communities are building toward, whether survival is a temporary condition preceding some larger project, or whether survival is the project, has not been answered. What the lore does suggest is that the factional landscape is still evolving, still shifting, still producing new arrangements and new conflicts and new possibilities, which is, in its own strange way, evidence of life. Dead things do not produce new arrangements, only living systems do. Chapter 4. Raiders, Outcasts, and the Will to Keep Going. There is a type of person who goes to the surface when they do not have to, who chooses the noise and the danger and the Ark-patrolled ruins over the relative safety of the underground, who wakes up before dawn, checks their gear, plans their route, and walks into a world that is demonstrably trying not to let them make it back. These are the people who matter most to the moment-to-moment experience of Ark Raiders, and they deserve a more careful examination than the word raider typically invites. The word raider carries connotations that do not entirely fit the people it is used to describe in this game. In most contexts, a raider is someone who takes from others by force, a predatory actor, someone whose activity is necessarily at someone else's expense. The raiders of the Ark Raiders world are not exactly that, though some of them are not entirely not that either. They are, more precisely, scavengers in the original and most neutral sense of the word. People who find value in what has been left behind, in what the Ark have made inaccessible to ordinary survival systems, and who provide that value to communities that cannot produce it themselves. The decision to become a raider is not based on what the lore suggests, typically made lightly or without awareness of the stakes involved. People become raiders for many reasons, and the variety of those reasons is one of the things that makes raider culture interesting as a social phenomenon. Some become raiders because they need to, because the economic options available to them within their community do not meet their material requirements, and raiding represents a way to close the gap. Some become raiders because they are suited to it, because their particular combination of skills and temperament finds its best expression in the specific demands of surface operation. And some become raiders because they want to, because something about the surface, even with all of its danger, calls to them in a way that the underground does not. That third category is the one that the other categories often find most difficult to understand. The person who goes to the surface, not out of need or suitability, but out of something closer to desire. This is not a universally approved motivation among the raider community or within the communities that depend on them. There is a sense in some quarters that wanting to go to the surface is a kind of psychological problem, a death wish dressed up as a professional orientation. But the raiders who operate from this motivation would, if pressed, describe something different. They would describe the surface as the only place where a certain kind of clarity exists, where the stakes are immediate and unambiguous, where the fog of social complexity that fills the underground burns away in the cold air and the danger and the unmistakable reality of the world as it actually is. The skill set of an effective raider is not simple, and the lore provides enough detail to construct a reasonably complete picture of what it takes. Physical fitness and combat capability are the obvious prerequisites, and they are real ones. The surface is dangerous in ways that do not accommodate the unprepared, but they are far from sufficient on their own. What distinguishes a good raider from a dead raider over the long run is a combination of perceptual acuity, tactical intelligence, situational awareness, emotional regulation under pressure, and the ability to make good decisions quickly with incomplete information. These are not common skills in combination, and the raiders who have developed all of them to a high level are genuinely impressive people to observe. Navigation is among the most critical raider skills, and it operates at multiple levels simultaneously. There is the navigational challenge of the physical environment, which is not stable in the way pre-ARC maps and surveys would suggest. ARC activity has altered the terrain in various areas. Structures have collapsed or been moved. New ARC constructions have created barriers that did not exist before. A route that was safe 6 months ago may not be safe today, and a route that was impassable a year ago may now be viable. Experienced raiders maintain a constant process of updating their mental maps based on observation and information exchange, treating their knowledge of the surface as a living document rather than a fixed reference. Navigation also means understanding ARC behavior patterns in specific areas, which overlaps with intelligence in the military sense. Knowing that a particular route through a particular zone is patrolled at certain intervals by certain types of ARC units is the kind of knowledge that saves lives, and it is the kind of knowledge that is extremely difficult to acquire without direct surface experience. This is one of the reasons why experienced raiders are so valuable, and why the relationship between experience and survival among raiders is not random. The people who have been doing this longest tend to have assembled the most complete and most accurate operational picture of the surface areas they work in, and that picture keeps them alive in situations that would kill someone operating on less information. The tools and equipment that raiders use are a mixture of pre-ARC technology that has been maintained, modified, and sometimes improved over the years, and recovered or repurposed ARC materials. The integration of ARC materials into human equipment is one of the more interesting practical lore threads in the game, because it represents a kind of forced dialogue between human technology and ARC technology that has produced genuinely novel results. ARC materials have properties that make them valuable for specific applications in raider gear if you can figure out how to work with them, which is not always easy given that the processes by which ARC materials are normally produced are entirely unknown. The workshops and technical specialists who work on raider equipment occupy a particularly important role in the communities they serve, because the quality of raider gear directly affects the survival rate of raiders, which in turn affects the resource flow that keeps communities operational. The people who do this work are not always raiders themselves. Some have never been to the surface, but their contribution to the surface operation is as real as the contribution of the people who actually go. The ecosystem of raider activity includes these technical contributors as full participants, not as support staff to the real actors. The relationship between raider teams and the communities they operate from is structured in ways that vary considerably between different factions and different community arrangements. In some cases, raiders are community employees, operating under direct organizational authority and returning their fines to a common pool. In others, they are independent contractors operating on their own account and selling their fines to the communities that want them. In still others, they operate in hybrid arrangements that involve elements of both models. The variety of these arrangements reflects the variety of the communities themselves, and also the variety of raider personalities, because the kind of raider who is happy operating as a community employee is a somewhat different person from the kind of raider who insists on operating independently. The economics of raiding, at whatever scale it is organized, are driven by the fundamental reality that certain things exist on the surface that cannot be obtained any other way. The specific items that raiders target vary by region, by the needs of their community, by the state of ARC activity in different areas, and by the practical opportunities that present themselves during any given run. There is a kind of market for redefines, and like any market, it is shaped by supply and demand. But the supply side of this market is constrained by danger in ways that no conventional market factor could capture. The cost of supply in this market is sometimes measured in lives. The culture of risk that has developed within raider communities is not the same as a culture of recklessness. Experienced raiders tend to be quite deliberate about risk assessment because they have had enough surface time to understand what carelessness costs. The stories that circulate within raider culture are not primarily stories of heroic close calls. They are more likely to be practical analyses of what went wrong in a given situation and how it could have been avoided. The folklore of raiding is, in significant part, a body of practical wisdom about how to survive the specific and varied ways that the surface tries to kill you. Death is a constant in raider life, and the culture has developed ways of dealing with it that are neither in denial of its reality nor overwhelmed by it. There are traditions around the loss of fellow raiders that provide both emotional processing and social acknowledgement of what has been lost. These traditions vary between communities and between raider teams, but their existence is consistent. The raider who does not come back is not simply a failed resource. They are someone specific whose particular knowledge, capability, and presence is gone, and the loss is registered as such. The relationship between experienced and inexperienced raiders is formalized in some communities and informal in others, but the transmission of knowledge from those who have survived to those who are beginning is recognized everywhere as critical to the survival of the raider community as a whole. New raiders who are simply sent to the surface without adequate preparation do not last long, and the loss of an inexperienced raider is, in resource terms, as well as human terms, a poor outcome for everyone. The investment in training and mentorship is therefore a survival priority, not a luxury. Teams of raiders, as opposed to individual operators, are the dominant model of surface operation for a variety of practical reasons that the law supports. The surface is too complex and too dangerous for a single person to manage well across all the dimensions that need to be managed simultaneously. A team can cover more angles of observation. A team can divide tactical and navigational responsibilities. A team can handle medical emergencies in a way that a solo operator cannot. A team can, in moments of crisis, make better decisions than a single individual because more perspectives are available to draw on. The team model is not universal, and there are solo operators who have found ways to make it work, but they tend to be exceptional people operating in specific conditions that favour their approach. The formation and dissolution of raider teams is one of the more emotionally rich threads in the social law of ARC raiders, because the relationships formed within these teams are typically intense, in the way that high-stakes shared experience always makes relationships intense. People who have survived difficult surface situations together develop a kind of trust and mutual knowledge that is genuinely rare. The loss of a team member is not just a tactical setback, it is a personal loss of the specific, non-replaceable kind. And the formation of a new team, or the addition of a new member to an existing team, is not a neutral organizational event. It is a social process that carries real weight. The identity of raider as a social category is something that people in the ARC Raiders world relate to in different ways depending on their background and community. In some contexts, raider is a respected professional identity, carrying connotations of skill, toughness, and service to the community. In others, it is a more ambiguous status, associated with danger and unconventionality in ways that make some community members uneasy. And in some communities, particularly those with more rigid social hierarchies, raider culture is seen with something closer to suspicion, because raiders tend to be independent-minded people who have been shaped by experiences that existing power structures do not fully control. The outcasts of the ARC Raiders world, the people who do not fit within any established community structure, and operate in the gaps between organized societies, are a distinct population from the raiders. Though there is some overlap, outcasts have been pushed out of, or have chosen to leave, the organized communities of the underground world. They survive on the surface or in the margins of established territory through combinations of skill, luck, and the development of informal networks with other outcasts and with sympathetic members of established communities. The reasons people become outcasts are as varied as the people themselves. Some were expelled from communities for violating community norms, which can mean anything from actual dangerous behavior to simply failing to conform to a particular community's expectations of appropriate conduct. Some left voluntarily because they could not accept the constraints of community life, or because they found a specific community's structure incompatible with their own values. Some became outcasts because the community they belong to no longer exists and they have not been absorbed into any other organized group. The outcast population is not organized, and that absence of organization is both their greatest vulnerability and, in a certain way, their defining characteristic. They have no collective power to draw on. They cannot enforce norms or provide the mutual aid that organized communities provide. What they have instead is the particular kind of competence that survival outside any support structure produces. Outcasts who last more than a few weeks on their own are, by definition, highly capable people in the specific domains the Ark Raiders world rewards. They have had to be. The relationship between outcasts and raider culture is complicated and not uniform. Some outcasts are, in practical terms, independent raiders. They do the same work but without community affiliation, which means without the social and material support that community membership provides, and without the obligations that membership imposes. This arrangement works for some people and fails catastrophically for others. The margin for error when operating without backup is considerably narrower than when operating with it, and outcasts who have survived for extended periods have typically developed an exceptionally precise calibration of risk and capability. The will to keep going, which is the third element of this chapter's title, is something that the Ark Raiders lore touches on in a way that feels genuine rather than performative. The question of why people continue to make the choice to go to the surface, to keep raiding, to keep pushing against a situation that could be passively endured with somewhat less risk, is not given a single answer in the game. Different characters offer different answers, and the game seems to respect all of them without declaring any of them definitively correct. For some raiders, the will to keep going is grounded in straightforward practical necessity. Their community needs them. The resources they bring back from the surface are genuinely critical to the people they care about. This is not a complicated answer, and it does not need to be. The obligation to provide for the people who depend on you is one of the oldest and most durable motivating forces in human experience, and it does not become less real when the context it operates in becomes extraordinary. For others, the will to keep going has a more personal character. It is connected to identity, to the sense that the person they are is only fully real when they're doing this particular thing in this particular world. The raider who has been doing this for a long time and who knows no other version of their adult life is not simply making an instrumental calculation about costs and benefits. They are doing the thing that they understand themselves to be. The surface is where they know how to be the person they are. The alternative is not just a lower risk life. It is, in some sense, being a different person. That is a harder swap to make than it might look from the outside. And for some, the will to keep going is connected to hope in a specifically directed sense. Not just the general hope of survival, but hope that something they are doing, some specific knowledge they might find, some specific resource they might recover, some specific observation they might make, might matter to the larger project of understanding what the Ark are and what can be done about them. This is the rarest flavour of motivation in the raider community, and perhaps the most poignant, because it requires maintaining a belief that individual human action can matter in the face of something so vastly larger than any individual that it makes the idea of mattering seem almost absurd. The children who grow up around raider culture develop a relationship to the surface world that is different from those who grow up in communities where raiding is distant from daily life. They grow up hearing the surface discussed as a real place, with real details, real challenges, and real people who navigate it. They grow up knowing raiders as neighbours and relatives rather than as abstract figures in a system they understand only theoretically. And many of them, when they are old enough to make the choice, choose to raid, not because they were forced to, because it is what the people they respect most do, because it is what makes sense to them given everything they have been surrounded by since childhood. The psychological toll of sustained raiding is something the law engages with, honestly, without either minimizing it or presenting it as a unique and spectacular form of suffering. The cumulative effect of operating regularly in a high-danger environment, of losing colleagues and sometimes friends, of having one's body subjected repeatedly to the physical demands of surface operation, is real, and it produces real changes in people over time. How raiders process this toll varies enormously. Some develop coping mechanisms that are functional and relatively healthy. Some develop mechanisms that are functional, but have costs in other domains of their lives. Some do not manage it well at all. The communities that depend on raiders are not, on the whole, particularly good at recognizing or responding to the psychological costs of raiding. They are good at recognizing and responding to physical injury. They are good at recognizing the absence of someone who does not come back. But the slower damage, the accumulation of loss and strain that can hollow a person out while leaving them functional enough to keep working, is harder to see and harder to respond to. This is not a failure unique to the Ark Raiders world. It is a failure that appears in every human context where high-risk work is normalized. But in a world where the raiders are holding a significant part of the survival structure together, it is a failure with broad consequences. The stories that raiders tell about each other, the legendary figures of the raider community who have done extraordinary things or survived extraordinary situations, are an important part of raider culture. These stories serve multiple purposes. They are entertainment in a world where entertainment is not always readily available. They are morale, a reminder that extraordinary things are possible and that the people who came before navigated situations at least as bad as the ones being faced now. And they are in their own way a kind of technical literature, encoding in narrative form lessons about what to do and what not to do in specific situations. The most respected raiders in the lore are not necessarily the ones who have had the most spectacular encounters with the Ark. They tend to be the ones who have lasted the longest, who have brought back the most, and who have done it with the fewest casualties of the people around them. Longevity is respected more than drama, in a community that has seen enough drama to know that drama is usually just another word for something going wrong. The raider who makes it look boring, who plans well enough that nothing unexpected happens and comes back every time, is the model that the raider community most genuinely admires, even if the dramatic stories are the ones that get told more often. The legacy of a raider who dies in the field is not automatic. It has to be made, which usually means it has to be told. The stories and accounts that circulate after a raider is lost are the means by which that person's experience, their knowledge, their particular way of navigating the world, is transmitted to the people who come after. This transmission is imperfect. Stories change, details are lost or altered, but something passes even through the imperfect medium of oral tradition and informal documentation, and that something has survival value for the community that receives it. The arc of a raider's life from the beginning of their surface career to its end, is a story that the law of arc raiders tells in fragments rather than in full, but the fragments accumulate into something recognizable as a life shape. The early period of learning and high risk, the middle period of growing competence, and the particular confidence that competence earned under pressure produces. The later period, for those who make it that far, where the experience is enormous and the body is not always what it was, where the question of how long to keep doing this becomes real in a way it was not before. These are the stages of a career that the games world recognizes and that the people within it navigate in their own ways. The will to keep going, ultimately, is not one thing. It is a composite of motivations that shift over time and that are organized differently in each person who carries them. What the law of arc raiders suggests is that this composite, however it is assembled in any individual, is not a mystery or an exception. It is, in this world, one of the most basic and most understandable of human responses to being alive in difficult circumstances. The people who keep going are not extraordinary because they go. They are extraordinary because of what they do when they get there. Chapter 5. The technology that rewrote the rules. The collision between pre-arc human technology and the arc's own technological systems is one of the most practically interesting and thematically rich threads in the entire Arc Raiders lore. It is also one of the areas where the game's world building does some of its most thoughtful work, because the approach taken to this collision is not the approach most science fiction takes. Most science fiction treats the discovery of superior alien technology as a clear upgrade path. You find the better technology, you study it, you implement it, your capabilities improve. Arc Raiders does something more complicated and more honest than that. The fundamental problem with Arc technology, from a human utilization standpoint, is not that it cannot be recovered. It can be, under the right conditions and with the right skills. The problem is that it cannot be fully understood, and the gap between using something and understanding it is enormous, when that something was made by a form of intelligence that operates according to principles that human science does not currently have frameworks for. You can use a tool you do not understand. People do it all the time. But your ability to use it well, to repair it when it breaks, to adapt it to new applications, and to recognize its limitations, all of these are severely compromised when the tool is built on principles you cannot explain. This distinction between use and understanding runs through all of the technological lore of Arc Raiders, and it generates a set of tensions that are both practically interesting and symbolically significant. The communities that have most aggressively pursued Arc technology for human use have gained real capabilities that communities relying only on pre-Arc technology do not have, but they have also taken on dependencies and risks that pre-Arc technology communities have avoided. When something goes wrong with Arc-derived systems, and sometimes it does, the ability to diagnose and fix the problem is limited in ways that analogous problems with human-built technology are not. The specialists who work most directly with Arc technology in human communities occupy a role that is as valued as it is poorly understood, even by the communities that rely on them. These individuals have developed, through a combination of systematic study and intuitive experimentation, a working relationship with Arc materials and systems that produces results other people cannot reliably replicate, whether what they're doing constitutes understanding in any meaningful scientific sense is something that the people themselves often doubt. It is more often described in the lore as a kind of feel, a sensitivity to how Arc systems behave under different conditions, knowledge that has been accumulated through trial and error rather than derived from principle. The development of this practical relationship with Arc technology without formal theoretical understanding is one of the ways the Arc Raiders world is quietly departing from its pre-Arc technological tradition. Pre-Arc human technology was, ideally at least, built on understood principles. The engineering disciplines that produced the infrastructure and devices of the pre-Ark world were grounded in physics and chemistry and mathematics that were taught, discussed, verified, and built upon over generations. The new technological practice that is emerging around Ark systems is, by contrast, largely pre-theoretical. It precedes understanding rather than flowing from it. It is craft rather than science, in the oldest sense of those terms. The question of whether this craft-based relationship with Ark technology can ever become something more theoretically grounded is one that different communities answer very differently. Some of the knowledge-focused communities are investing significant resources in trying to develop a theoretical framework for Ark materials and systems, working from the available evidence of what those systems do toward hypotheses about how and why they do it. This work is slow and produces more questions than answers, but the people doing it believe it is necessary to any longer-term project of genuinely engaging with Ark technology on terms that are not entirely defined by the Ark. The repurposing of Ark materials for human-scale applications is perhaps the most common form of Ark technology integration in the human communities of the Ark Raiders world, and it is where the most practical progress has been made. Ark materials, as previously noted, have properties that make them valuable for specific applications. Extreme durability, unusual thermal and electrical characteristics, resistance to the kinds of degradation that affect most materials under surface conditions. Human craftspeople and engineers have found ways to incorporate these materials into human-designed tools, structures, and systems in ways that enhance the performance of those systems without requiring a full understanding of why the Ark materials behave as they do. This selective integration is smart adaptation rather than straightforward adoption, and the distinction matters. A tool that uses Ark material for a component that benefits from Ark material specific properties while relying on human understood materials and design principles for everything else is a tool whose creators understand most of what they have made. The Ark material component is a known unknown. The rest is understood as well as any comparable pre-Ark technology. This kind of partial integration produces better tools than pure human technology, without the full dependency and fragility of complete reliance on Ark systems. The weapons that raiders carry into the surface world are among the most interesting examples of this mixed technology approach. Pre-Ark weapons, maintained and sometimes modified from their original designs, remain the primary tool of raider combat, but they are often augmented with Ark-derived components that improve specific performance characteristics. The reasoning behind which components to augment and how is a body of practical knowledge that resides within raider communities and the technical specialists who support them, and it is not always well documented or fully articulated. It is, again, more craft than science. The arc of weapons development in the raider community since the initial period has not been toward bigger or more powerful weapons, which might be the expected trajectory if you thought of raider operations primarily in combat terms. It has been toward more reliable, more versatile, and more maintainable weapons. Reliability is the paramount concern for a raider, because an equipment failure on the surface is not an inconvenience. It is a potentially fatal event. A weapon that performs spectacularly under ideal conditions but fails in the rain or after sustained use is a worse choice than a weapon that performs adequately across all conditions and can be maintained in the field without specialized tools. The armor and protective equipment used by raiders has followed a similar logic. The integration of Ark materials into raider protective gear has produced significant improvements in protection-to-weight ratio, which is critical for surface mobility. But the design philosophy is consistently oriented toward reliability and repairability over maximum performance in any single dimension. Equipment that can be partially repaired in the field using materials that are reasonably available on or near the surface is worth more than equipment with superior specifications that cannot be fixed when it breaks. This is a design philosophy that reflects the realities of operating in a world where resupply and repair infrastructure is distant and uncertain. The energy technologies that have been developed or adapted in the Ark Raiders world are a particularly rich area of lore, because the problem of power generation and storage underlies virtually every other technological challenge the human communities face. The underground communities require power for light, climate control, food production, manufacturing, and all the other functions that keep them operational. The surface operations require power for equipment, for communication, for any Ark technology-derived systems that need it. Power is, in a real sense, the foundational resource of the Ark Raiders world. The pre-Ark power systems that survived or were recovered and maintained represent the starting point for current human energy technology, but they have been supplemented and, in some cases, significantly modified over the years. Some communities have developed impressive engineering solutions to the power problem using purely human-understood technology. Others have incorporated Ark-adjacent energy systems in ways that improve their power situation, but introduce the same dependency and fragility issues discussed in relation to other Ark technology integrations. The observation that certain Ark systems seem to be connected to each other in ways that are not fully understood by human engineers has produced both opportunities and problems for communities trying to work with Ark technology. An Ark-derived component that is part of a larger Ark system may behave differently when isolated from that system than when connected to it. This behavior variation is difficult to predict and has produced a number of near disasters when components that behaved one way in testing behave differently in deployment. Understanding these system-level dependencies and either working with them or finding ways to isolate components from them is one of the ongoing technical challenges of Ark Raiders world. Communication technology is another domain where the collision between pre-Ark systems and the Ark-altered world has produced interesting challenges. The surface environment, as altered by Ark activity, is not a neutral medium for human radio communications. Certain frequencies are degraded or blocked by Ark activity. Certain areas have interference patterns that make reliable communication difficult. The development of communication approaches that work within these constraints has required significant creative engineering, and the solutions that have been found are often unconventional by pre-Ark standards. The underground communities have generally been able to maintain relatively good internal communication infrastructure because the underground environment is more controllable than the surface. But communication between underground communities, which must often route through surface relays or through physical messengers, is slower and less reliable than pre-Ark external communications were. This is one of the ways in which the informational landscape of the Ark Raiders world has been constrained, as discussed earlier, by the physical realities of the environment the Ark have created. Medical technology in the Ark Raiders world is a domain that the law handles with particular gravity because the stakes of medical capability are as direct and human as stakes get. The ability to treat injuries and illness determines who lives and who dies in the most fundamental way, and the degradation of medical infrastructure after the Ark's arrival has been one of the most painful aspects of the new world for the people living in it. Pre-Ark medical technology was extraordinary by historical standards. The post-Ark world has access to a reduced and imperfect subset of that technology, and the gap is felt in the most personal ways possible. The preservation and reproduction of pre-Ark medical knowledge is among the highest priorities of the knowledge-focused communities in the Ark Raiders world, and the people who carry that knowledge as practitioners are among the most valued members of any community. Medical supplies recovered from the surface are consistently among the highest priority raider targets, and the raider teams sent to recover them are often among the best equipped and most carefully selected. The calculus of medical supply is brutal and direct. Without certain supplies, people who would have survived in the pre-Ark world do not survive. The supply determines who lives. That simplicity does not make the problem easier, it makes it harder. The Ark's apparent relationship to their own technology is something that the human researchers studying them have found deeply puzzling, because it does not seem to map onto any human model of technology use. Human technology, even sophisticated human technology, is generally designed to be used and maintained by the humans who use it. It has interfaces. It has modes of operation that are accessible to people who have been trained in them. The Ark technology that human researchers have been able to study closely does not appear to have this quality. It does not seem to be designed to be used by anyone. It seems to simply operate, following its own internal logic, without any provision for external interaction or adjustment. Whether this means that the entities we call the Ark are not, themselves, users of Ark technology in any sense that parallels human technology use is a question that the law raises without resolving. It is possible that the Ark interact with their technology in ways that are simply not legible to human observers. It is also possible that the concept of use, in the human sense, does not apply to the relationship between the Ark and the systems they deploy. A termite nest is built by termites, but individual termites do not use it in the way a human uses a house. The relationship between the builder and the built thing is categorically different at different levels of organization. The discovery of pre-Ark artifacts that show evidence of interaction with Ark technology is one of the most carefully handled pieces of law in the game, because its implications are significant regardless of which way you interpret it. The evidence in question is ambiguous, deliberately so. It consists of pre-Ark materials and structures that show signs of alteration or interaction that might be attributable to Ark activity. The ambiguity is in the timing. Were these interactions made during the Ark's arrival, or before it? And if before it, how long before it? This question, as noted in an earlier chapter, points toward the possibility that the Ark's relationship to Earth is older than the event that human survivors think of as the beginning. If that is the case, it raises questions about what the Ark were doing here before and why they appear to have departed and returned. The technological evidence for this possibility is not conclusive, and the people who have studied it most carefully acknowledge that the evidence could be explained in other ways. But it is consistent with the hypothesis, and it is the kind of evidence that you cannot entirely dismiss once you have seen it. The role of the nexus, the specific term, varies in different parts of the law, but the concept of a central Ark coordinating system, or hub, appears across multiple law sources. This is the idea that the various Ark elements, the units, the structures, the overhead presence, are connected to and ultimately coordinated by something at a higher level of organization than any of the parts individually visible to human observers. Whether this nexus or coordination system exists as a physical structure somewhere on or near Earth, or whether it exists at a level of abstraction that does not require a specific physical location, is something the law does not resolve. The existence of something like a nexus would explain several observed features of Ark behavior that are otherwise difficult to account for. The consistency of Ark activity patterns across geographically separated regions, the apparent coordination of responses to specific events that occur faster than any visible communication mechanism would allow. The way changes in Ark behavior in one area sometimes seem to precede changes in other areas in ways that suggest shared information, rather than independent responses to shared stimuli. All of these observations are more naturally explained if there is some overarching coordination happening than if every Ark element is acting autonomously. The human technology that has been most transformed by the Ark's arrival is not the technology that was most directly affected by Ark activity. It is the technology of navigation and survival, which has had to adapt to a world that is fundamentally different from the world it was originally designed for. Maps are one example. Pre-Ark cartography was extremely accurate and extremely detailed for most of the world's surface. Post-Ark cartography is necessarily provisional, frequently updated, and full of areas of acknowledged uncertainty where Ark activity has altered the terrain or made direct observation too dangerous to be reliable. The development of Ark monitoring technology, systems designed to detect and track Ark activity in specific areas, represents one of the more impressive achievements of post-Ark human engineering. This technology is imperfect and has significant limitations, but it has been genuinely important to the development of safer surface operation practices. Knowing where and when Ark units are likely to be present is enormously valuable to raiders planning operations, and the people who develop and maintain Ark monitoring systems are recognized as critical contributors to surface operation capability. The longer-term technological implications of the Ark's presence on Earth are something that the more forward-thinking researchers in the Ark Raiders world think about, even though most day-to-day technological work is focused on immediate practical problems. The question of what human technology might look like a generation or two from now, if things continue as they currently are, produces answers that range from cautiously optimistic to deeply unsettling, depending on who is doing the thinking. The optimistic vision involves a continued process of careful integration and adaptation, with human engineering gradually developing better frameworks for working with Ark technology and eventually, perhaps, beginning to genuinely understand it. This vision imagines a trajectory toward capability that is greater than anything the pre-Ark world had access to, built on a synthesis of human and Ark technological traditions that takes the best of both. It is an appealing vision and not an impossible one, but it requires things to go well in ways that the Ark Raiders world has not always been kind enough to allow. The pessimistic vision involves a different trajectory, one in which the dependency on Ark technology grows faster than the understanding of it, producing communities that are capable only as long as Ark-derived systems continue to function, and devastatingly vulnerable when they do not. This vision imagines a future in which the knowledge that would allow human communities to maintain themselves independently of Ark technology gradually erodes, because it is no longer necessary in day-to-day function, a future in which the apparent stability of Ark-dependent communities conceals a fragility that would only become visible in a crisis. This vision is also not impossible, and the people who hold it make arguments that deserve to be taken seriously. The technological choices that communities make now, in the period when the Ark Raiders world is still in the process of determining what its long-term condition will be, are therefore not simply practical decisions. They are, in a sense, values decisions. They reflect what communities believe about the future, about what survival should look like, about what risks are acceptable in pursuit of what benefits. And those values decisions, made in the relatively unglamorous domain of engineering and material choice, will shape the world that the people who come after the current generation inherit. Chapter 6. The Hidden Law. Nobody talks about. There are parts of the Ark Raiders law that are not ignored because they are unimportant. They are ignored because they are difficult, because they do not fit comfortably into the simpler narratives that most people use to organize their understanding of what happened to this world and what is happening in it. These are the pieces that, when you look at them directly, require you to revise something you thought you knew. They are in many ways the most interesting pieces, and in this chapter we're going to look at them directly. The first of these difficult pieces is the evidence, which is fragmentary but persistent, that some human beings have been able to establish something approximating a communicative relationship with the Ark. Not a full relationship, not a dialogue in any meaningful sense of the word, but a level of interaction that goes beyond what most people in the Ark Raiders world believe is possible, and that produces results that cannot be easily explained by the standard models of Ark indifference to human presence. The people who have achieved this level of interaction are not a category that any established faction in the Ark Raiders world has officially recognized or systematically studied. They are individuals, typically people who have spent extended time in close proximity to Ark activity, often in circumstances that were not chosen and not entirely survivable in the normal course of events. Something about sustained intensive exposure to the Ark, possibly combined with particular characteristics of the individuals involved, seems to have produced a change in how those individuals are perceived or processed by Ark units. The nature of this change is described inconsistently across the various lore sources that touch on it, which is part of why it is so difficult to discuss. Some accounts suggest that certain individuals have become in some sense invisible to Ark detection, that they can move through areas of intense Ark activity without triggering the defensive responses that other humans reliably trigger. Other accounts suggest something different, not invisibility but recognition, a state in which Ark units do not treat the individual as a neutral object to be ignored, but as something that has been categorized differently from the default human classification. The implications of either version of this phenomenon are significant enough that you would expect them to be a major focus of research and community attention. The fact that they are not, or not openly, points towards something about how this information is managed within the Ark Raiders world. The most plausible explanation is that the communities and factions with access to this information have made deliberate decisions not to publicize it, for reasons that range from protecting the individuals involved to maintaining control over what is potentially an enormously valuable strategic asset. The individuals who have these unusual relationships with the Ark are not, based on the fragmentary lore available, uniformly happy about their situation. For some, it represents a genuine advantage that has allowed them to do things and survive situations that would have been impossible otherwise. For others, it represents a profound and unsettling change in their own identity. If the Ark interacts with you differently than they interact with other humans, what does that say about what you are? If you are not, from the Ark's perspective, fully classifiable as the same category of thing as your fellow humans, what is the category you have moved into, and what are the implications of that movement? The question of Ark classification of humans is one that the lore touches on in ways that are easy to miss if you are not looking for them. The default assumption, supported by the standard behavior of Ark units, is that humans are simply not a category that the Ark have any framework for, that we are neither threat nor resource in terms that the Ark can usefully engage with. We are, in the default model, essentially invisible at the level of intentionality, even though we are visible at the physical level. The behavior of Ark units toward humans who provoke them suggests they are recognized as potential threats in a reactive sense. But there is no evidence that humans are tracked, catalogued, or managed in the way that the Ark seem to track and manage the resources they are actually interested in. The possibility that this default classification could be changed, either by individuals developing unusual relationships with the Ark, or by more systematic efforts to make human presence legible to Ark systems in a different way, is one that various parties in the Ark Raiders world have considered. The practical applications of such a change, if it could be achieved reliably and controllably, would be transformative. But the path from where things currently are to a state where such a change is possible and controlled is completely unclear, and the attempts to move in that direction that the lore hints at have not all ended well. The documents that deal with what might be called contact research, the systematic attempts to develop understanding of the Ark that goes beyond behavioral observation and into something like genuine inquiry into their nature, are among the more unsettling pieces of lore in the game. Not because the work they describe is morally questionable, though some of it edges in that direction. But because of what they reveal about what happens when you get close enough to the Ark to learn something genuinely new about them. The cost of proximity is, in the law, consistently high. Whether that cost is biological, psychological, or something less easily categorized depends on the specific account. The biological effects of extended Ark exposure are something the law handles with care, providing evidence of effects without fully explaining their mechanism. People who have spent significant time near Ark activity in the surface world show, according to medical records and personal accounts within the game, a range of physiological changes over time. Some of these are straightforward effects of the environmental conditions associated with Ark activity. Others are less straightforwardly explained. The medical communities within the Ark Raiders world have documented these effects carefully, and they are recognized as real, but their underlying mechanism is not understood. Whether these biological effects are a form of harm, a neutral adaptation, or something else entirely is a question the law does not answer definitively. There are people within the game's world who believe that the changes produced by Ark exposure are purely damaging and should be avoided and treated as injury. There are others who believe, more controversially, that some of the changes represent a kind of adaptation to the new world that is actually advantageous in certain respects. And there are a very few who have developed frameworks for thinking about Ark exposure that do not fit neatly into either the harm model or the adaptation model, and who believe that what is happening is something more complex and more significant than either. The memory phenomena associated with Ark exposure are among the strangest pieces of lore in the game. Multiple independent sources describe a particular quality of altered memory that some individuals who have been near the Ark report. Not memory loss, which would be the expected response to neurological trauma. Something different, a kind of memory enhancement or alteration that affects not what is retained but how it is experienced. Things remembered from after the period of exposure have a quality that things remembered from before it do not. Whether this is a reliable perceptual change, a psychological response to extraordinary experience, or something with a more physical explanation, is debated within the communities that have any information about it. The political suppression of certain lore elements is something that the game implies without shouting about. There are gaps in the available documentation. There are references in some documents to other documents that do not appear to exist in the accessible archives. There are personal accounts that break off at points where something significant is about to be revealed. This pattern of absence, of missing pieces in places where pieces should be, suggests that the flow of information in the Ark Raiders world is not simply constrained by the difficulty of gathering it. It is, in some cases, actively managed. Who is managing it, and toward what end, is something the law leaves as an open question. The most obvious candidates are the most powerful factional actors, who have the most to gain from controlling what the general population knows and believes about the Ark, but the specific pieces that seem to be missing or suppressed do not always serve the obvious interests of the obvious powerful actors. Sometimes, the information that seems to be absent is information that would strengthen rather than weaken existing power structures, if it were known. Which suggests that the management of information in the Ark Raiders world is more complicated than a simple story of power protecting itself. The relationship between Ark activity and certain locations that were significant before the Ark's arrival is a thread in the lore that has not been widely followed, but that produces interesting results when you pull on it. There are places in the Ark Raiders world where Ark activity is significantly more or less intense than the surrounding areas, and those places do not always map onto geological or material resource explanations. Some of them correspond to sites that had specific human significance before the fall. Archaeological sites, religious sites, sites with unusual historical depth. The interpretation of this correspondence is, again, something the law presents as contested. The most parsimonious explanation is coincidence, or that the geological or material factors that attracted human settlement and significance also attracted Ark attention. But there are people in the Ark Raiders world who take the correspondence more seriously than that, and their arguments are not easily dismissed. If the Ark have been to Earth before, and if they left marks that influenced human settlement patterns over a long period of time, then the correspondence between significant human sites and significant Ark activity sites might be a very old relationship expressing itself across a vast timescale. The children born to people who have had significant Ark exposure are a subject the law approaches very carefully, without drawing conclusions that the available evidence does not support. What the law does make available is a consistent interest on the part of several different communities in tracking these children over time. The reasons given for this tracking vary: medical monitoring, community planning, routine public health surveillance. But the consistency with which this particular population is monitored across different communities with different stated reasons for doing so suggests that the interest goes beyond any of the official explanations. Whether the children of Ark-exposed individuals show any characteristics that distinguish them from other children in the communities they grow up in is something the law is careful not to definitively answer. There are hints in some accounts of things that might be differences, but the accounts are personal and subjective, and the differences, if they exist, are subtle enough to be below the threshold of systematic detection by the methods currently available. Whether better methods would reveal something significant is something the communities doing the monitoring clearly believe is worth finding out. The rumours that circulate within raider networks about specific areas of the surface that are permanently forbidden, not by Ark activity in the normal sense but by factional decision, are another piece of hidden law worth examining. Raiders have well-developed instincts for information about where they can and cannot go, and the informal networks through which this information circulates are generally reliable about Ark-based hazards. When the restriction on an area comes from a factional source rather than an Ark source, experienced raiders notice the difference. And when the stated reasons for the restriction do not quite add up, they notice that too. The areas that seem to be under factional restriction, rather than simply Ark hazard avoidance, are not clustered in ways that follow the patterns of ordinary resource or security logic. They are scattered, and the coverage of information about what makes them worth restricting is consistently just thin enough to be suspicious. The most commonly encountered explanation is that the areas contain something valuable that the restricting faction wants exclusive access to. This is a plausible explanation for some of the cases. For others, the resource logic does not hold, and the alternative explanations that experienced raiders develop to account for the restriction tend to be more interesting. The concept of Ark memory, a term that appears in some of the more speculative law documents, refers to a hypothesis that Ark structures and systems retain, in some form, information about the areas they have been present in and the events that have occurred in those areas. This hypothesis is developed from observations that certain Ark units in certain areas behave in ways that suggest they have access to information about that specific location that they could not have gathered from direct observation alone. Behaviour that is more precisely calibrated than general Ark activity patterns, oriented towards specific features of a specific place rather than expressing general Ark operational protocols. If Ark structures retain something like memory of their environment, and if this memory is accessible in some way to human technology or human senses under the right conditions, the implications for the project of understanding the Ark are substantial. It would mean that the surface world itself is, in a sense, a record, that the ruins and the altered structures and the Ark additions to the landscape are not just physical evidence of what happened, but are also potentially informational evidence, that the history of the Ark's activity and possibly the history of their previous presence on Earth, could be read from the physical environment if only you had the right way to read it. The people who have begun to develop tools and practices oriented toward reading the surface world in this way are not, generally, the most prominent or well-resourced researchers in the Ark Raiders world. They are more often individuals operating at the margins of their communities with limited resources and limited institutional support, following a line of inquiry that most of their peers find either implausible or uncomfortably close to the kind of Ark-adjacent thinking that makes established communities nervous. But the preliminary results of their work are not nothing, and the law suggests that at least some of what they have found is being paid closer attention than it might appear. The hidden history of early human-Ark contact in the first days and weeks after the Ark's arrival is another area where the accessible law has significant gaps. The period is documented, but the documentation has a quality of careful editing that is not present in the records of later periods. The jagged edges of first-hand experience, the contradictions and confusions of real events as they unfold, have been smoothed in ways that suggest the records have been processed by people who had reason to present a particular version of what happened. What the edited version leaves out, or what can be inferred from the patterns of absence in the early records, is a picture of the initial period that is somewhat different from the standard account. The standard account emphasizes the scale of the Ark's arrival and the inability of any human response to significantly affect it. What the gaps in the record suggest is that there may have been moments in the early period where the outcome was not as predetermined as the standard account implies. Moments where something happened that did not fit the narrative of inevitable, overwhelming Ark superiority. The significance of this, if it is true, is not that the outcome would have been different. It probably would not have been. But if there were moments where human action produced results that surprised or deviated from Ark behavior, as subsequently observed, those moments are data points about Ark behavior that the current understanding of the Ark does not account for. They represent conditions under which the Ark responded differently than expected. And understanding those conditions, if they can be recovered and analysed, might be among the most valuable information available for anyone seriously thinking about what a different future might look like. The law document that is referenced most obliquely and least completely in the available archive is one that several characters in the game's world appear to know about and choose not to discuss directly. Its existence is implied by gaps in other documents, by references that do not quite point to anything findable, by the consistent way that certain lines of conversation in the law seem to approach something and then redirect away from it. What this document might contain, what it might describe that is worth this level of careful circumspection, is not specified anywhere in the available law. But the consistent pattern of avoidance around it suggests that whatever it contains is significant enough to be considered dangerous or destabilizing, or both. The personal logs of the earliest raiders, people who went to the surface in the months immediately after the Ark's arrival, when service conditions were at their most chaotic and least understood, are among the most emotionally powerful pieces of lore in the game when they can be found. These are accounts of people navigating a world that was in the process of being transformed in real time, with none of the practical knowledge and established protocols that raider culture would eventually develop. They made decisions based on instinct and desperation, and they observed things that later experience was needed to contextualize and understand. Reading these accounts with what is now known that they did not then know is a particular kind of melancholy that the game earns. The relationship between the Ark and time, beyond the simple observation that they seem to operate on longer timescales than humans, is something that some of the more speculative lore materials venture into. The hypothesis that the Ark's relationship to time is not merely a matter of planning horizon, but is something more fundamental, a different relationship to temporal experience itself, is developed in a small number of documents that are careful to flag themselves as speculative. The evidence for this hypothesis is indirect and interpretive, but it has a kind of explanatory power for some of the ark's more puzzling behaviours that the simpler timescale explanation lacks. Chapter 7. What the end of the world looks like. When you're still in it. The thing about endings is that they are only visible in retrospect. When you're living through something that will later be called the end of a world, it does not announce itself as such. It happens in pieces. Some of the pieces are loud and dramatic and clearly mark a break with what came before. Others are quiet, barely distinguishable from the ordinary accumulation of change that all living systems undergo. The world of Ark Raiders is a world that has had its ending and is still inhabiting it, still working out what that means, still deciding whether ending is the right word for what actually happened. The human communities that persist in the Ark Raiders world are proof that what happened was not a complete ending, in the most literal sense. People are still here. The project of human life, with all of its complexity and contradiction and occasional beauty, is still ongoing. The lights are still on in the places they are supposed to be on, most of the time. Children are still growing up. Arguments are still being had about things that would have seemed trivial before the Ark's arrival, and now seem essential because they are what people have to argue about in a world that has contracted around the essentials. But the world that existed before the Ark's arrival is, in the most meaningful sense, gone. Not because the physical matter that composed it has been removed or destroyed. A great deal of that matter is still present, in forms altered by Ark activity or simply left, mostly unchanged by it. What is gone is the particular arrangement of that matter that had meaning in human terms. The cities that were organised around human purposes, the networks of human relationship and institution that extended across the surface of a planet that was, if not owned by humanity, at least managed by it in ways that assumed human presence and human purpose as the organising principle. That arrangement is not recoverable. This is something that the Ark Raiders world is in the process of coming to terms with, in different ways and at different rates in different communities. The communities that are still oriented primarily toward restoration, toward rebuilding something that resembles what was lost, are working against a reality that does not support their project. Not because the will is insufficient, and not because the human capacity for rebuilding is insufficient, but because the world into which they are trying to rebuild is fundamentally different from the world the previous arrangement was built for. The communities that have made peace with that fact, or at least a working peace, are the ones that seem most capable of genuine adaptation. Not because they have given up on everything the pre-Ark world represented, but because they have understood that the values and purposes that made the pre-Ark world worth valuing are not inseparable from the specific physical and social arrangements that express them. You can care about human connection, about knowledge, about justice, about beauty, about the particular quality of being alive that makes life worth the trouble, in a world that does not look anything like the world in which you originally learned to care about those things. The Ark Raiders world is making an argument, quietly and persistently, about the nature of civilization. The argument is that civilization is not primarily a physical arrangement. It is a practice. It is something that is done by people in the circumstances they find themselves in. The materials change, the setting changes, the specific forms of the practice change. But the practice itself, the ongoing human project of organising life around meaning rather than purely around survival, continues in the Ark Raiders world in ways that are recognisable as continuous with everything that came before, even when the surface forms are unrecognisable. The Raiders in this framework are not marginal figures. They are not the apocalyptic warriors of a fallen world, doing violence to survive in a landscape of ash. They are, in a very ordinary and very important way the people who make it possible for the civilizational practice to continue. They are the interface between the surface world and the underground communities. They are the ones who ensure that the materials for the practice are available. Their work is unglamorous in the way that most essential work is unglamorous, and it is heroic in the way that essential work always is, which is quietly and without dramatic announcement. The children growing up in the Ark Raiders world are, more than any other group, the evidence of the argument the game is making. Children being born and raised in this world did not choose to be here. They were put here by circumstances and by the choices of the people who came before them. The way all children, everywhere, are put where they are by circumstances and prior choices. What they make of where they are, the kind of people they become, the kind of world they construct within the constraints of the world they inherited, is the ongoing story. And that ongoing story is not defined by the Ark. It is defined by them. The ways in which the Ark Raiders world looks ahead to a future that is better than the present are not always the ways you might expect. There are community leaders who speak in explicitly hopeful terms about the eventual departure of the Ark, or about the eventual development of a way to coexist with them or counter them. But there is also a quieter, more pervasive form of looking ahead that does not necessarily depend on any of those dramatic possibilities. It is visible in the maintenance work that extends the lifespan of existing infrastructure, in the teaching relationships between experienced raiders and new ones, in the decisions to document and archive knowledge even when there is no immediate practical return on the investment, in the choice to name a bunker hope. The question of what the Ark ultimately want, which has been circling through this entire video without being definitively answered, remains open as we approach the end of this account. And I think it should remain open, not because the answer is necessarily unknowable, but because the condition of not knowing is itself one of the most important features of the Ark Raiders world. The human communities in this world are living with a fundamental uncertainty about the nature and intentions of the most significant force in their environment. They are making decisions, developing cultures, raising children, and building whatever comes next in a state of irreducible ignorance about what is happening at the larger scale of the world they inhabit. That condition is not unique to a science fiction world overrun by mechanical entities from space. It is the condition of every human being who has ever lived, operating in a world they did not make and cannot fully understand, making choices that matter without being able to see all of the consequences of those choices. The Ark Raiders world makes that condition more visible by making it more extreme. But it is not manufacturing something that was absent before. It is amplifying something that was always there. The lore of Ark Raiders suggests, in its quieter moments, that the most important thing about the human response to the Ark is not the strategic or tactical dimension. It is not about whether humanity will find a way to fight back, or negotiate, or escape. Those are real dimensions of the situation, and they matter. But what the game seems most consistently interested in, at the level of the stories it tells and the details it chooses to include, is the human response at the scale of daily life, the choices made by individuals in specific circumstances, the relationships formed between people who find themselves in the same strange situation, the ways that people continue to be fully human in the richest sense, under conditions that seem designed to reduce them to something less. The specific details that make the Ark Raiders world feel real rather than merely plausible are details of exactly this kind. The coffee mug beside the keyboard, the child's drawing on the partially collapsed wall, the name given to a bunker. These details are not strategically important. They are not going to affect the outcome of any factional conflict or any encounter with the Ark, but they are the details that make the world a world rather than a backdrop. They are the evidence that what was here before the Ark's arrival was fully human, with all of the warmth and ordinariness and particularity that entails. And they are the reason that the loss of it carries weight. The ongoing mystery of what the Ark are and what they're doing is not going to be resolved by any account of the lore that exists in the game as of this telling. It is a mystery the game has chosen to maintain, and the choice seems deliberate and productive. A mystery that is maintained is an invitation. It invites the player and the listener to be in the same epistemic position as the characters in the game's world, to not know, to have theories and uncertainties and competing interpretations, to feel, in a small and imaginary way, something of what it would be like to live in a world where the most important question has no accessible answer. The endings that exist within the Ark Raiders world are, appropriately, not clean. Communities that seem stable become unstable. Raiders who seem to have solved the problem of the surface find new versions of the problem. Information that seemed to settle a question opens new questions. The ongoing nature of the crisis does not resolve into a narrative arc in the sense of rising action and climax and denouement. It continues. And the continuation is, in some ways, the point. The people who inhabit this world have not found a way to defeat the Ark. They have not found a way to understand them fully. They have not found a way to restore the world as it was. What they have found is a way to keep going, and the specific shape of that way is the most interesting thing about them. It is not a triumphant shape. It is not particularly dramatic. It is the shape of persistence, of the quiet refusal to stop being human, even when the world has given you a great deal of reason to settle for something less. The Ark Raiders world is ultimately a world about that refusal, about what it costs, about who bears the cost, about what it produces when it is sustained over time by communities and individuals who are not special in any predetermined way, but who make themselves capable of what the situation requires. The Raiders are the most visible face of this refusal because their work takes them to the most visible edge of the situation. But the refusal is not theirs alone. The technician who repairs the gear, the medic who treats the injury, the archivist who copies the document, the parent who explains the world to the child, the person who names a bunker hope even when hope is genuinely difficult to locate. These are all expressions of the same fundamental thing, the insistence that what is happening here matters, that the people here matter, that the continuation of the human project in this strange and damaged world is worth the effort it requires. Ark Raiders asks, through all of its lore and all of its world building, what that effort actually consists of when you strip away the comfortable framing. What does it mean to persist? What does it mean to carry on? Not in heroic terms, not in the language of destiny or triumph, in the actual terms of waking up in a bunker called hope, checking your gear, and going back to the surface one more time. Because the people who depend on you need what the surface has, and you are one of the people capable of getting it. The answer the game offers is not a simple one. It is a life, complicated and costly and specific and real. It is the particular lives of particular people in a particular strange situation, lived with as much fullness and care and intelligence and connection as those people can manage under the conditions they find themselves in. Which is to say, it is the same answer that every world has always offered to the same question. Just in a version that strips away enough of the comfortable background noise to make the question, and the answer, impossible to avoid. The Ark are still there. The surface is still dangerous. The mystery is still unresolved. And the people of Speranza and every other community that has managed to hold itself together in the ruins and the underground and the in-between spaces of this altered world are still getting up in the morning and doing the things that need to be done. Continue no matter what. 2237, plotted script continuation with expanded chapter structure. Plotted script continuation with expanded chapter structure. Chapter 8, The Stories Nobody Tells. Twice, there is a particular category of story in the Ark Raiders world that circulates once and then goes quiet. Not because the people who heard it forgot it, not because it was determined to be false, but because it is the kind of story that, once you've heard it and sat with it long enough to feel its full weight, you become reluctant to pass on. The reluctance is not quite superstition and not quite rational caution. It is something in between, a sense that the story carries something with it when it travels, that telling it makes the thing it describes more present somehow, that some stories are better left as rumours than confirmed as accounts. The raiders who have the most surface time are the most likely to have encountered at least one story of this kind, and the most likely to understand the reluctance without needing to have it explained. The surface does things to your understanding of what is possible that the underground cannot fully prepare you for. You see things that do not fit the frameworks you brought with you, and sometimes the appropriate response to a thing that does not fit your framework is not to immediately revise the framework. It is to carry the observation quietly for a while and see whether time and additional evidence resolve the contradiction or deepen it. The stories that nobody tells twice tend to cluster around certain themes, and the clustering is itself informative. They are not random in their subject matter. They share a preoccupation with the boundary between what the Ark are understood to be and what they might actually be. They share a concern with what happens when a human being gets close enough to the Ark to observe something that standard models do not account for. And they share a particular emotional register that is not quite fear and not quite awe, but combines elements of both with something that does not have a comfortable name. The first cluster of these stories concerns Ark units that appear to deviate from established behavioural patterns in ways that are not explicable as responses to conventional stimuli. Standard Ark unit behaviour, as documented through years of radar observation, is predictable enough to be tactically usable. Units patrol defined areas. They respond to specific triggers in specific ways. They coordinate with other units in ways that have been mapped well enough to allow experienced raiders to navigate around them reliably. When a unit does something outside these established patterns, it is noticeable. When it does something that seems, however cautiously you frame it, intentional in a way that goes beyond programmed response, it is disturbing. The accounts of these behavioural deviations are not uniform in their details, because they represent independent observations under different conditions by different people who were not in communication with each other when the events occurred. But the pattern is consistent enough to be taken seriously by the people who have accumulated the most operational knowledge of the surface. Something, in certain circumstances, seems to happen to Ark unit behaviour that exceeds the standard model. Whether the something is significant and what it might indicate about the Ark is something that has been debated in whispers in raider communities for years. One of the most commonly referenced categories of deviation involves Ark units pausing in their activity in what seems like a responsive way to human presence that has been carefully arranged to be invisible to standard Ark detection. Raiders who have spent years developing the ability to move through Ark-active areas without triggering responses have, in a small number of documented cases, had the experience of an Ark unit appearing to stop and orient toward them despite their best efforts at concealment. Not attacking, not pursuing, simply pausing. And then, after a period of time that varies in different accounts, but is consistently described as unnervingly long, resuming what it was doing. The interpretation of this behaviour is genuinely contested among the people who have experienced or heard reliable accounts of it. The most conservative interpretation is that the units have detection capabilities beyond what has been observed in standard encounters, and that the pause represents processing of ambiguous input data. The unit detected something, was unable to classify it, and waited while its systems processed the unclassifiable input before defaulting to normal operation. This interpretation is the most comfortable one, because it does not require revising any fundamental assumption about what arc units are. A less conservative interpretation holds that the pause represents something more than processing, that the unit did classify the human presence correctly, and that the response to that correct classification was the pause itself. That what looks like detection, followed by failure to respond, is actually recognition, followed by deliberate non-response. And if that is what it is, the implications are significant, because deliberate non-response requires at minimum a decision. And a decision, however you model the mechanism that produced it, is not the same as a programmed behavior. The accounts that come from the zones of highest arc activity, the areas that experienced raiders consider the most dangerous and most avoid unless the operational requirements are compelling, describe arc behavior that is qualitatively different from what is observed in lower activity zones, and not simply in the sense of higher density or greater aggression. The behavior in high activity zones has a character that experienced raiders struggle to articulate precisely, but that they consistently describe in terms that suggest something more organized and more deliberate than the standard model supports. Words like purposeful come up. Words like aware. These are not words that the standard model of arc behavior accommodates. Whether the high activity zones represent areas where arc organization or intelligence is operating at a qualitatively higher level, or whether the apparent difference in behavioral character is a perceptual artifact of being in a more dangerous environment with more stimuli pressing on your attention, is something that cannot be definitively determined from the available evidence. But the consistency with which experienced observers, people who have enough surface time to have calibrated their perceptions against the full range of arc behavior, describe the high activity zones as different in kind rather than just in degree, as a data point that deserves weight. The stories about what happens to raiders who do not come back from high activity zones are predictably among the most emotionally charged pieces of informal lore in the raider community. The absence of the people who are lost is the primary fact, and the secondary fact is that, in most cases, nobody is recovered. The surface has a number of mechanisms by which a human body might be lost without recovery. The arc are not the only or even necessarily the most likely explanation, but the specific absences that are associated with high activity zones have, in some cases, been investigated enough to rule out the most common alternative explanations. What happens to someone taken by the arc, if that is what has happened in some of these cases, is a question that the law does not answer, and that the people most involved in asking it have not been able to determine. The most alarming possibility is the most frequently discussed in the quiet conversations where these stories are told, and it is the one that most needs to be held carefully rather than speculated about carelessly. That the arc have, in some cases, collected rather than destroyed the humans they encountered, and that the purpose of that collection, whatever it is, has not been identified or understood. The category of story that concerns the interior of large arc structures, experienced by the very small number of people who have managed to enter one and return, is perhaps the most significant and most carefully guarded piece of informal lore in the entire raider community. There are only a handful of first-person accounts of the interior of a significant arc structure. Most people who have entered one have not returned. The few who have returned have had significant difficulty describing what they encountered in terms that their audience can fully register. The difficulty of description is not simply about the strangeness of what was seen, though the strangeness is significant. It is about the particular quality of the experience itself, which the people who have been through it consistently describe as different from any other experience in a way that makes normal language feel inadequate. Not traumatic in the conventional sense, not simply frightening, something that affected their relationship to the categories they use to organize experience in a way that lingered after the experience itself was over. The physical descriptions of Ark interiors that can be extracted from these accounts describe spaces that are, at a basic level, what you might expect from structures of the scale and apparent function of Ark constructions. Large, complex, organized around purposes that are not immediately legible. Materials that behave in the ways Ark materials generally behave when observed at close range. But the details that do not fit expectations are the ones that are hardest to characterize and hardest to dismiss. The apparent absence of what might be called operational noise is consistently noted. Human machines make sounds and produce vibrations and have a quality of busy activity that is detectable as such. The interiors of Ark structures, even structures that are clearly active and clearly doing something significant, have a quality that the people who have been inside them describe as absolute in its scale. Not quiet in the way that a building at night is quiet. Quiet in a way that suggests a fundamentally different relationship between function and sound than anything in human experience. As if the work being done inside these structures produces no byproduct of the kind that human work always produces. The sense of scale inside Ark structures is described as disorienting in ways that go beyond the disorientation of simply being in a large space. Human-built large spaces, even very large ones, retain a quality of human proportion in their design. You can locate yourself within them using the cognitive tools that evolved for navigating human-scaled environments. The insides of Ark structures do not have this quality. The spaces do not have the kind of internal reference points that human-built spaces provide, whether intentionally or as a byproduct of being built by human hands, according to human intuitions about proportion and scale. Several of the accounts describe something that could be interpreted as evidence of Ark awareness of their presence during the time they spent inside the structure. Not the aggressive response that Ark units typically have to human presence in Ark active zones. Something different, a quality of attention that was directed at them without producing any action that could be classified as threat or hostility. Being seen without any consequence following from being seen in a space that is not designed for you to be in by whatever is responsible for that space is an experience that the people who have had it do not easily put down afterward. The things observed inside Ark structures that most resist categorization are the elements of the accounts that are most carefully handled in this telling, and deliberately so, not because they are not real in the accounts of the people who describe them, but because the accounts themselves are clear that the reliability of observation under the conditions of the experience is compromised in ways that the observers themselves acknowledge. What was seen might be accurately perceived and accurately reported. It might also be the output of a perceptual system operating at the edge of its capability in conditions it was not designed for. Holding both possibilities simultaneously, without collapsing into either certainty, is the appropriate stance for the listener. The aftermath of time inside an Ark structure, for the people who have had that experience and returned to describe it, is consistent enough across independent accounts to be taken seriously as a real phenomenon. The people who came back were different from how they went in, and not in ways that are fully explicable as the psychological aftermath of an extreme experience. The changes were specific and they were persistent. They affected how the individuals interacted with Ark environments generally, not just how they responded to having been inside a specific structure. The nature and implications of those changes are among the most carefully guarded pieces of information in the communities that know about them. The stories about what happened in the early days of the Ark's arrival that were never officially documented are a distinct category of hidden lore, different from the accounts of individual, unusual surface experiences. These are stories about what governments, institutions, and organized responses did in the first weeks and months. before the scale of what was happening became undeniable, and before the response became purely reactive and survival-oriented. Some of these stories have been deliberately suppressed. Others have simply been lost in the chaos of the period. Others exist in fragmentary form in personal records that have not been systematically assembled. What these stories collectively suggest, when you try to piece them together from the fragments available, is that the initial institutional response to the Ark's arrival was not as helpless as the standard account implies. There were people in positions of authority and capability who understood quickly what was happening, or at least understood that it was something unprecedented that required an unprecedented response. And those people made decisions in the first days and weeks that shaped the subsequent history of the Ark Raiders world in ways that are still playing out. Whether those decisions were the right ones, given what was known at the time and what has become known since, is something that cannot be determined from this distance. But they were consequential, and some of the consequences are things that the current communities of the Ark Raiders world are living with without fully understanding where they came from or what choices produced them. The infrastructure that exists in the underground communities, the specific location and design of the tunnels and chambers and support systems that the surviving human population depends on, reflects decisions made in those early days by people who had to act quickly with incomplete information. Some of those decisions were brilliant, some were compromises, some were probably mistakes that have been absorbed into the background of the current world as simply how things are, without anyone currently alive fully understanding why they are that way rather than some other way. The individuals who made those decisions, the architects of early survival, are now either dead or extremely elderly, and the law treats them with the ambivalence that complex historical figures always deserve. They did things that saved many lives. They may also have done things that constrained future options in ways that were not fully anticipated. They were operating under conditions that no existing framework had prepared them for. Judgment of them in either direction requires holding the complexity of that situation rather than collapsing it into simple heroism or simple failure. The particular configuration of factional power that currently exists in the Ark Raiders world is in significant part a legacy of those early decisions and the power dynamics that crystallized around them. The communities that got a head start, the ones that were best positioned in the early period, have in many cases maintained advantages that compound over time. The communities that were marginalized in the early period have had to find different paths to survival, and in some cases those paths have produced capabilities and approaches that the originally advantaged communities lack.